Chapter 15. The Man. They clattered along Kalakala Avenue in Chan's car. John Quincy sat alone on the rear seat. At the detective's request, he held the Ohio wood box on his knee. He rested his hands upon it. Once it had eluded him, but he had it now. His mind went back to that night in the attic, 2,000 miles away. The shadow against the moonlit window. The sting of a jewel cutting across his cheek. Roger's heartfelt cry of poor old Dan. Off Sarah. Directly my fine man. Did they hold at last, in this Ohio wood box, the answer to the mystery of Dan's death? Howlett was waiting in his room. With him was a keen-eyed, efficient-looking man, evidently in his late 30s. "Hello, boys," said the captain. "Mr. Winterslip, meet Mr. Green, our district court prosecutor." Green shook hands, cordially. "I've been wanting to meet you, sir," he said. "I know your city rather well. Spent 3 years at your Harvard Law School." "Really?" replied John Quincy with enthusiasm. "Yes. I went there after I got through at a New Haven. I'm a mailman, you know?" "Oh," remarked John Quincy, without any enthusiasm at all. But Green seemed a pleasant fellow, despite his choice of college. Chan had set the box on the table before Howlett, and was explaining how they had come upon it. The captain's thin face had brightened perceptibly. He inspected the treasure. "Lock day," he remarked. "You got the key, Keola?" The Hawaiian shook his head sullenly. "No." "Watch your step, boy," warned Howlett. "Go over him, Charlie." Chan went over him rapidly and thoroughly. He found a key ring, but none of the keys fitted the lock on the box. He also brought to light a fat roll of bills. "Where'd you get all that money, Dick?" Howlett inquired. "I got it," glowered the boy. But Howlett was more interested in the box. He tapped it lovingly. "This is important, Mr. Green. We may find the solution of our puzzle in here." End quote. Once the list, he took a small chisel from his desk, and after a brief struggle, pried open the lid. John Quincy, Chan, and the prosecutor pressed close, their eyes staring eagerly as the captain lifted the lid. The box was empty. "Filled with nothing," murmured Chan. "Another dream? Go smash against stone wall." The disappointment angered Howlett. He turned on Keola. "Now, my lad," he said, "I want to hear from you. You've been in touch with Braid. You talked with him last Sunday night. You've heard he's returning tonight. You've got some deal on with him. Come across and be quick about it." "Nothing to tell," said the Hawaiian stubbornly. Howlett leaped to his feet. "Oh, yes, you have. And by heaven, you're going to tell it. I'm not any too patient tonight. And I warn you, if you don't talk and talk quick, I'm likely to get rough." He stopped suddenly and turned to Chan. "After Charlie, that inter-island boat is due from Maui about now. Get down to the dock and watch for Braid. You've got his description." "Sure," answered Chan. Thin, pale face. One shoulder descended below other gray mustaches that droop in saddened mood. "That's right. Keep a sharp lookout. And leave this lad to us. You won't have any secrets when we get through with him, eh, mister?" Green? The prosecutor, more discreet, merely smiled. "Mr. Winterslip," said Chan, "the night is delicious. A little stroll to Moonlee Dock." "I'm with you," John Quincy replied. He looked back over his shoulder as he went, and reflected that he wouldn't care to be in Cowlett's shoes. The pier shed was dimly lighted, and a small but diversified group awaited the incoming boat. Chan and John Quincy walked to the far end, and there, seated on a packing case, they found the waterfront reporter of the evening paper. "Hello, Charlie," cried Mr. Mayberry. "What you doing here?" "Maybe friend arrive on boat," Gran Chan. "Is that so?" responded Mayberry. "You boys over at the station have certainly become pretty mysterious all of a sudden." "What's doing, Charlie?" "All pronouncements come from Captain," advised Chan. "Yeah, we've heard his pronouncements," sneered Mayberry. "The police have unearthed clues and are working on them. Nothing to report at present. It's sickening." "Well, sit down, Charlie." "Oh, Mr. Winterslip, good evening. I didn't recognize you at first." "How are you?" said John Quincy. He and Chan also found packing cases. There was a penetrating odor of sugar in the air. Through a wide opening in the pier shed, they gazed along the waterfront and out upon the moonlit harbor. A rather exotic and intriguing scene, John Quincy reflected, and he said as much. "Think so?" answered Mayberry. "Well, I don't. To me, it's just like Seattle or Galveston or any of those stereotyped ports. But you see, I knew it when. I think you mentioned that before." John Quincy smiled. "I'm likely to mention it at any moment. As far as I'm concerned, the harbor of Honolulu has lost its romance. Once this was the most picturesque waterfront in the world, my boy. And now look at the damn thing." The reporter relighted his pipe. "Charlie can tell you. He remembers the old, ramshackle, low-lying wharves. Old Naval Row with its sailing ships. The wooden hold steamers with a mast or two. Not too proud to use God's good winds occasionally. The bright little rowboats, the Aloha,
The Emma, the Aloha, the Emma."
Ancient, all extinct," agreed Chan. "You wouldn't see a Rotary Club gang like this on a pier in those days." Mayberry continued. "Just Hawaiian stevedores, with leis on their hats and ukuleles in their hands. Fishermen with their nets, and maybe a breezy, old-time purser, a glad-hander, and not a mere machine." He puffed a moment in sad silence. "Those were the days, Mr. Winterslip, the days of Hawaii's isolation and her charm. The cable and the radio hadn't linked us up with the so-called civilization of the mainland. Every boat that came in, we'd scamper over it, hunting a newspaper with the very latest news of the outside world. You remember those steamer days, Charlie, when everybody went down to the wharf in the good old hacks of yesteryear, when the women wore holokus and low-holer hats and Berger was there with his band and maybe a prince or two, and the knights," suggested Charlie. "Yeah, old-timer. I was coming to the nights." The soft nights, when the serenaders drifted about the harbor in rowboats, and the lanterns speared long paths on the water. He seemed about to weep. John Quincy's mind went back to books he had read in his boyhood. "And occasionally," he said, "I presume somebody went aboard a ship against his will." "I'll say he did," replied Mr. Mayberry, brightening at the thought. "Why, it was only in the 90s. I was sitting one night on a dock a few yards down, when I saw a scuffle near the landing, and one of my best friends shouted to me, 'Goodbye, Pete.' I was up and off in a minute, and I got him away from them. I was younger in those days. He was a good fellow, a sailorman, and he wasn't intending to take the journey that bunch had planned for him. They got him into a saloon and drugged him, but he pulled out of it just in time. Oh, no, those days are gone forever now. Just like Galveston or Seattle. Yes, sir, this harbor of Honolulu has lost its romance." The little inner island boat was drawing up to the pier, and they watched it come. As the gangplank went down, Chan rose. "Who you expecting, Charlie?" Asked Mayberry. "We grope about," said Chan. Maybe on this boat, or Miss Braid. Braid? Mayberry leapt to his feet. Not so sure, warned Chan. Only a matter, we suppose. If correct, humbly suggest you follow to the station. You might capture news. John Quincy and Chan moved up to the gangplank as the passengers descended. There were not many aboard. A few island businessmen, a scattering of tourists, a party of Japanese in Western clothes, ceremoniously received by friends ashore, a quaint little group, all bowing from the waist. John Quincy was watching them with interest when Chan touched his arm. A tall, stooped Englishman was coming down the plank. Then Thomas McCann Braid would have been easily spotted in any crowd. His mustache was patterned after that of the Earl of Pawtucket, and to make identification even simpler, he wore a white pith helmet. Pith helmets are not necessary under the kindly skies of Hawaii. This was evidently a relic of Indian days. Chan stepped forward. Mr. Should Braid. The man had a tired look in his eyes. He started nervously. Yes, he hesitated. I am Detective Sergeant Chan, Honolulu Police. You will do me the great honor to accompany me to the station, if you please. Braid stared at him, then shook his head. It's quite impossible, he said. Pardon me. Please, answered Chan. It or inevitable. I have just returned from a journey, protested the man. My wife may be worried regarding me. I must have a talk with her. And after that, regret purred Chan, or scorchingly. But duty remains duty. Chief's words are law. Humbly suggest we squander valuable time. Am I to understand that I'm under arrest? Flared Braid. The idea is preposterous, Chan assured him. But the captain waits eager for statement from you. You will walk this way, I am sure. A moment's pardon. I introduce my fine friend, Mr. John Quincy Winterslip of Boston. At mention of the name, Braid turned and regarded John Quincy with deep interest. Very good, he said. I'll go with you. They went out to the street, Braid carrying a small handbag. The flurry of arrival was dying fast. Honolulu would shortly return to its accustomed evening calm. When they reached police station, Howard and the prosecutor seemed in high good humor. Kalala sat in a corner, hopeless and defeated. John Quincy saw at a glance that the boy's secret was his no longer. Introducing Mr. Braid, said Chan. Ah, cried Howard. We're glad to see you, Mr. Braid. We've been getting pretty worried about you. Really, sir, said Braid. I am completely at a loss. Sit down, ordered Howard. The man sank into a chair. He, too, had a hopeless, defeated air. No one can appear more humble and beaten than a British civil servant, and this man had known 36 years of baking under the Indian sun, looked down on by the military, respected by none. Not only his mustache, but his whole figure drooped in saddened mood. Yet now and then, John Quincy noted, he flashed into life, a moment of self-assertion and defiance. Where have you been, Miss Braid? Howard inquired. I have visited one of the other islands. Naui. You went last Tuesday morning? Yes, on the same steamer that brought me back. Your name was not on the sailing list, Howard said. No, I went under another name. I had reasons. Indeed? The flash of life. Just why am I here, sir? He turned to the prosecutor. Perhaps you will tell me that. Green nodded toward the detective. Captain Howlett will enlighten you, he said. You bet I will, Howlett announced. As perhaps you know, Mr. Braid, Mr. Dan Winterslip has been murdered. Braid's washed-out eyes turned to John Quincy. "Yes," he said. "I read about it in a Hilo newspaper." "You didn't know it when you left last Tuesday morning?" Hallett asked. "I did not. I sailed without seeing a paper here." "Ah! Yes." "When did you see Mr. Dan Winterslip last?" "I never saw him." "What?" "Be careful, sir. I never saw Dan Winterslip." "All right. Where were you last Tuesday morning at 20 minutes past 1? "I was asleep in my room at the Reef and Palm Hotel. I've retired at 9:30, as I had to rise early in order to board my boat. My wife can verify that." "A wife's testimony, Mr. Braid, is not of great value." Braid leaped to his feet. "Look here, sir. Do you mean to insinuate—" "Take it easy," said Hallett smoothly. "I have a few matters to call to your attention, Mr. Braid. Mr. Dan Winterslip was murdered at 1:20 or thereabouts last Tuesday morning. We happen to know that in his youth he served as first officer aboard the Maid of Shiloh, a blackbirder. The master of that vessel had the same name as yourself. An investigation of your room at the Reef and Palm," cried Braid. "By what right I am hunting the murderer of Dan Winterslip," broke in Hallett coolly. "And I follow the trail wherever it leads. In your room, I found a letter from the British consul here addressed to you, and informing you that Winterslip was alive and in Honolulu. I also found this tin of Corsican cigarettes just outside the living room door of Winterslip's house. We picked up the stub of a Corsican cigarette. It's a brand not on sale in Honolulu." Braid had dropped back into his chair and was staring in a dazed way at the tin box in Hallett's hand. Hallett indicated the Hawaiian boy in the corner. "Ever see this lad before, Mr. Braid?" Braid nodded. "You had a talk with him last Sunday night on the beach?" "Yes." "The boys told us all about it. He read in the paper that you were coming to Honolulu. His father was a confidential servant in Dan Winterslip's employ, and he himself was brought up in the Winterslip household. He could make a pretty good guess at your business with Winterslip, and he figured you'd be pleased to lay hands on this Ohio woodbox. In his boyhood, he'd seen it in a trunk in the attic of Winterslip's San Francisco house. He went down to the President Tyler and arranged with a friend aboard that boat, the quartermaster, to break into the house and steal the box. When he saw you last Sunday night, he told you he'd have the box as soon as the President Tyler got in, and he arranged to sell it to you for a good sum. Am I right so far, Mr. Brad?" "You were quite right," said Braid. "The initials on the box are T.N.B. Hallett persisted. "They are your initials, are they not?" "They happen to be," said Braid. "But they were also the initials of my father. My father died aboard ship in the South Seas many years ago, and that box was stolen from his cabin after his death. It was stolen by the first officer of the Maid of Shiloh, Mr. Dan Winterslip." For a moment, no one spoke. A cold shiver ran down the spine of John Quincy Winterslip, and a hot flush suffused his cheek. Why, oh why, had he strayed so far from home? In Boston, he traveled in a rut, perhaps, but ruts were safe, secure. There no one had ever brought a charge such as this against a Winterslip. No whisper of scandal had ever sullied the name. But here, Winterslips had run amok, and there was no telling what would next be dragged into the light. "I think, Mr. Braid," said the prosecutor slowly, "you had better make a full statement." Braid nodded. "I intend to do so. My case against Winterslip is not complete, and I should have preferred to remain silent for a time. But under the circumstances, of course I must speak out. I'll smoke if you don't mind." He took a cigarette from his case and lighted it. I'm a bit puzzled just how to begin. My father disappeared from England in the 70s, leaving my mother and me to shift for ourselves. For a time, we heard nothing of him. Then letters began to arrive from various points in Australia and the South Seas. Letters with money in them, money we badly needed. I have since learned that he had gone into the blackbirding trade. It was nothing too proud of, God knows. But I like to recall in his favor that he did not entirely abandon his wife and boy. In the 80s, we got word of his death. He died aboard the Maid of Shiloh and was buried on the island of Appian in the Gilbert Group, buried by Dan Winterslip, his first officer. We accepted the fact of his death, the fact of no more letters with remittances, and took up our struggle again. 6 months later, we received from a friend of my father in Sydney, a brother captain, a most amazing letter. This letter said that, to the writer's certain knowledge, my father had carried a great deal of money in his cabin on the Maid of Shiloh. He had done no business with banks. Instead, he had had this strong box made of Ohio wood. The man who wrote us said that he had seen the inside of it, and that it contained jewelry and a large quantity of gold. My father had also shown him several bags of green hide, containing gold coins from many countries. He estimated that there must have been close to 20,000 pounds in all. Dan Winterslip, the letter said, had brought the Maid of Shiloh back to Sydney and turned over to the proper authorities my father's clothing and personal effects, and a scant 10 pounds in money. He had made no mention of anything further. He and the only other white man aboard the Maid, an Irishman named Hagen, had left at once for Hawaii. My father's friend suggested that we start an immediate investigation. Well, gentlemen, Braid looked about the circle of interested faces. What could we do? We were in pitiful circumstances, my mother and I. We had no money to employ lawyers to fight a case thousands of miles away. We did make a few inquiries through a relative in Sydney, but nothing came of them. There was talk for a time, but the talk died out, and the matter was dropped. But I have never forgotten. Dan Winterslip returned here and prospered. He built on the foundation of the money he found in my father's cabin a fortune that inspired the admiration of Honolulu. And while he prospered, we were close to starvation. My mother died, but I carried on. For years it has been my dream to make him pay. I have not been particularly successful, but I have saved, scrimped. I have the money now to fight this case. 4 months ago, I resigned my post in India and set out for Honolulu. I stopped over in Sydney. My father's friend is dead, but I have his letter. I have the depositions of others who knew about that money, about the Ohio wood box. I came on here, ready to face Dan Winterslip at last, but I never faced him. As you know, gentlemen, Braid's hand trembled slightly as he put down his cigarette. Someone robbed me of that privilege. Some unknown hand removed from my path the man I have hated for more than 40 years. You arrived last Saturday, a week ago, said Howitt, after a pause. On Sunday evening, Kawala here called on me. He offered you the strong box. He did, Braid replied. He'd had a cable from his friend and expected to have the box by Tuesday. I promised him $5,000 for it, a sum I intended Winterslip should pay. Kawala also told me that Hagen was living on a ranch in a remote part of the island of Maui. That explains my journey there. I took another name, as I didn't want Winterslip to follow my movements. I had no doubt he was watching me. You didn't tell Kawala you were going either. No, I didn't think it advisable to take him completely into my confidence. I found Hagen but could get nothing out of him? Evidently, Winterslip had bought his silence long ago. I realized the box was of great importance to me, and I cabled Kaola to bring it to me immediately on my return. It was then that the news of Winterslip's death came through. It was a deep disappointment, but it will not deter me. He turned to John Quincy. Winterslip's heirs must pay. I am determined they shall make my old age secure. John Quincy's face flushed again. A spirit of rebellion, of family pride, outraged, stirred within him. We'll see about that, Mr. Braid, he said. You have unearthed the box, but so far as any proof about valuables, money. One moment, cut in green, the prosecutor. Mr. Braid, have you a description of any article of value taken from your father? Braid nodded. Yes. In my father's last letter to us, I was looking through it only the other day. He spoke of a brooch he had picked up in Sydney. A tree of emeralds, rubies, and diamonds against an onyx background. He said he was sending it to my mother, but it never came. The prosecutor looked at John Quincy. John Quincy looked away. I'm not one of Dan Winterslip's heirs, Mr. Braid, he explained. As a matter of fact, he was a rather distant relative of mine. I can't presume to speak for his daughter, but I'm reasonably sure that when she knows your story, this matter can be settled out of court. You'll wait, of course. I'll wait, agreed Braid. And now, Captain. Hallett raised his hand. Just a minute. You didn't call on Winterslip. You didn't go near his house? I did not, said Braid. Yet just outside the door of his living room, we found, as I told you, the stub of a Corsican cigarette. It's a matter still to be cleared up. Braid considered briefly. I don't want to get anyone into trouble, he said. But the man is nothing to me, and I must clear my own name. In the course of the chat with the proprietor of the Reef in Palm Hotel, I offered him a cigarette. He was delighted when he recognized the brand, said it had been years since he'd seen one. So I gave him a handful, and he filled his case. Your speaking of Jin Egan, suggested Howard delightedly. Of Mr. James Egan, yes, Braid replied. That's all I want to know, said Howard. Well, Mr. Green, the prosecutor addressed Braid. For the present, we can't permit you to leave Honolulu, he said. But you are free to go to your hotel. This box will remain here until we can settle its final disposition. Naturally, Braid rose. John Quincy faced him. I'll call on you very soon, he promised. What? Oh, yes. Yes, of course. The man stared nervously about him. If you'll pardon me, gentlemen, I must run. I really must. He went out. The prosecutor looked at his watch. Well, that's that. I'll have a conference with you in the morning, Howlett. My wife's waiting for me at the country club. Good night, Mr. Winterslip. He saw the look on John Quincy's face and smiled. Don't take those revelations about your cousin too seriously. The 80s are ancient history, you know. As Green disappeared, Hallett turned to John Quincy. What about this, Gokula? Disconcerted, he inquired. It will be a pretty complicated job to prosecute him and his housebreaking friend on the President Tyler, but it can be done. A uniformed policeman appeared at the door, summoning Chan outside. Oh, no, said John Quincy. Let the boy go. We don't want any publicity about this. I'll ask you, Captain, to keep Braid's story out of the papers. I'll try, Howlett replied. He turned to the Hawaiian. Come here. The boy rose. You heard what this gentleman said. You ought to be sent up for this. But we've got more important things to attend to now. Went along, beat it. Shan came in just in time to hear the last. At his heels followed a sly little Jap and a young Chinese boy. The latter was attired in the extreme of college-cut clothes. He was an American, and he emphasized the fact. Only one moment, Chan cried. New and interesting fact emerge into light. Gentlemen, my cousin Willie Chan, captain all Chinese baseball team and demon backstopper of the Pacific. Pleased to meet you, said Willie Chan. Also, Okamoto, who have auto stand on Kalakala Avenue, not far from Winterslip household. No, Okamoto, said Howlett. He sells Oko Ahau on the side. No, indeed, protested the Jap. Auto stand? That is what? Willie, the small investigating, to help out crowded hours, went on Chan. He have dug up strange event out of this Okamoto here on early morning of Tuesday, July 1st. Okamoto was roused from slumber by fierce knocks on door of room. He go to door. Let him tell it, suggested Howlett. What time was this? 2 of the morning. AF, said the Jap. Tweeted of the morning open spirits to press in 8 knocks where is described. I rouse and look. At watch, run to door. Mr. Dick Cola here is waiting. Demand I drive him to home over in Iwile district. I done so. All right, said Howlett. Anything else? No? Charlie, take him out and thank him. That's your specialty. He waited until the Orientals had left the room, then turned fiercely on Kauola. Well, here you are, back in the limelight, he cried. Come across. What were you doing out near Winterslip's house the night of the murder? Nothing, said the Hawaiian. Nothing. A little late to be up doing nothing, wasn't it? Look here, my boy. I'm beginning to get you. For years, Dan Winterslip gave you money, supported you, until he finally decided you were no good. So, he stopped the funds, and he had a big row. No, didn't you? Yes, admitted Dick Kaola. On Sunday night, Braid offered you $5,000 for the box. You thought it wasn't enough. The idea struck you, but maybe Dan Winterslip would pay more. You were a little afraid of him, but you screwed up your courage and went to his house. No, the boy cried. I did not go there. I say you did. You'd made up your mind to double-cross Braid. You and Dan Winterslip had another big scrap. You drew a knife. Lies, all lies, the boy shouted, terrified. Don't tell me I lie. You killed Winterslip, and I'll get it out of you. I got the other, and I'll get this. Howlett rose threateningly from his chair. Chan suddenly re-entered the room and handed Howlett a note. Arrived this moment by special messenger, he explained. Howlett ripped open the envelope and read. His expression altered. He turned disgustedly to Kaola. Beat it. He scowled. The boy fled gratefully. John, Quincy, and Chan looked wonderingly at the captain. Howlett sat down at his desk. It all comes back to Egan, he said. I've known it from the first. Wait a minute, cried John Quincy. What about that boy? Howlett crumpled the letter in his hand. Kala. Oh, he's out of it now. Why? That's all I can tell you. He's out of it. That's not enough, John Quincy said. I demand to know. Howlett glared at him. You know all you're going to, he answered angrily. I say Kawala's out, and that settles it. Egan killed Winterslip, and before I get through with him, permit me to say, interrupted John Quincy,
that you have the most trusting nature I ever met.
Everybody's story goes with you. The Compton women and that rat Leatherby come in here and spin a yarn, and you bow them out. And Blade. What about Braid? In bed at 1:20 last Tuesday morning, eh? Who says so? He does. Who can prove it? His wife can. What was to prevent his stepping out on the balcony of the Reef and Palm and walking along the beach to my cousin's house? Answer me that. Howlett shook his head. It's Egan. That cigarette.
Yes.
That cigarette. How's it occurred to you that Braid may have given him those cigarettes purposely? Egan did it, cut in Howlett stubbornly. All I need now is his story. I'll get it. I have ways and means. I congratulate you on your magnificent stupidity, cried John Quincy. Good night, sir. He walked along Bethel Street, Chan at his side. You are partly consumed by anger, said the Chinaman. Humbly suggest you cool. Calm heads needed. But what was in that note? Why wouldn't he tell us? In good time we know. Captain, honest man, be patient. But we're all at sea again, protested John Quincy. Who killed Cousin Dan? We get nowhere. So very true, agreed Chan. More clues lead us into presence of immovable stone wall. We sway about, seeking still other path. I'll sayly do, answered John Quincy. There comes my car. Good night. Not until the trolley was halfway to Waikiki did he remember Mr. Saladin. Saladin crouching outside that window at the Reef and Palm. What did that mean? But Saladin was a comic figure, a lisping searcher after bridge work in the limpid waters of Waikiki. Even so, perhaps his humble activities should be investigated. Chapter 16. The Return of Captain Cope. After breakfast on Sunday morning, John Quincy followed Miss Minerva to the lanai. It was a neat world that lay outside the screen, for Dan Winterslip's yard boy had been busy until a late hour the night before, sweeping the lawn with the same loving thoroughness a housewife might display on a precious oriental rug. Barbara had not come down to breakfast, and John Quincy had seized the opportunity to tell his aunt of Braid's return and repeat the man's story of Dan Winterslip's theft on board the Maid of Shiloh. Now he lighted a cigarette and sat staring seriously out at the distant water. Cheer up, said Miss Minerva. You look like a judge. I presume you're thinking of poor Dan. I am. Forgive and forget. None of us ever suspected Dan of being a saint. A saint? Well, far from it. He was just a plain. Never mind, put in his aunt sharply. Remember, John Quincy, man is a creature of environment, and the temptation must have been great. Picture Dan on that ship, and these easy-going latitudes, wealth at his feet, and not a soul in sight to claim it. I've gotten wealth at that. Even you, even I, said John Quincy sternly, would have recalled I am a Winterslip. I never dreamed I'd live to hear you offering apologies for that sort of conduct. She laughed. You know what they say about white women who go to the tropics. They lose first their complexion, then their teeth, and finally your moral sense. She hesitated. I've had to visit the dentist a good deal of late, she added. John Quincy was shocked. My advice to you is to hurry home, he said. When are you going? Oh, soon. That's what we all say. Returning to Boston, I suppose. Of course. How about San Francisco? Oh, that's off? I did suggest it to Agatha, but I'm certain she won't hear of it. And I'm beginning to think she'd be quite right. His aunt rose. You'd better go to church, said John Quincy severely. That's just where I am going. She smiled. By the way, Amos is coming to dinner tonight, and he'd best hear the Braid story from us, rather than in some garbled form. Barbara must hear it too. If it proves to be true, the family ought to do something for Mr. Braid. The family will do something for him, all right, John Quincy, whether it wants to or not. Well, I'll let you tell Barbara about him, Miss Minerva promised. Thank you so much, replied her nephew sarcastically. Not at all. Are you coming to church? No, he said. I don't need it the way you do. She left him there to face a lazy, uneventful day. By 5 in the afternoon, Waikiki was alive with its usual Sunday crowd. Not the unsavory holiday throng seen on mainland beach, but a scattering of good-looking people. He stand straight. John Quincy summoned sufficient energy to don a bathing suit and plunge in. There was something soothing in the warm touch of the water, and he was becoming more at home there every day. With long, powerful strokes, he drew away from the Nichiassini breakers to dare the great roars beyond. Surfboard riders flashed by him. Now and then, he had to alter his course to avoid an outrigger canoe. On the farthest float of all, he saw Carlotta Egan. She sat there, a slender, lovely figure, vibrant with life, and awaited his coming. As he climbed up beside her and looked into her eyes, he was, perhaps from his exertion in the water, a little breathless. I rather hoped I'd find you, he panted. Did you then, Joe? She smiled faintly. I hoped it too. You see, I need a lot of cheering up. On a perfect day like this, I'd pinned such hopes on Mr. Braid, she explained. Perhaps you know he's back, and from what I can gather, his return hasn't meant a thing so far as Dad's concerned. Not a thing. Well, I'm afraid it hasn't, John Quincy admitted. But we mustn't get discouraged. As Chan puts it, we sway about, seeking a new path. You and I have a bit of swaying to do. How about Mr. Saladin? I've been thinking about Mr. Saladin, but I can't get excited about him somehow. He's so ridiculous. We mustn't pass him up on that account, admonished John Quincy. I caught a glimpse of his purple bathing suit on the first float. Come on, we'll just casually drop in on him. I'll race you there. She smiled again and leaped to her feet. For a second, she stood poised, then dived in a way that John Quincy could never hope to emulate. He slipped off in pursuit, and though he put forth every effort, she reached Saladin's side 5 seconds before he did. Hello, Mr. Saladin, she said. This is Mr. Winterslip of Boston. Ah, yes, responded Mr. Saladin gloomily. Mr. Winterslip. He regarded the young man with interest. Any luck, sir? Inquired John Quincy, sympathetically. Oh, you heard about my accident? I did, sir, and I'm sorry. I am too, said Mr. Saladin feelingly. Not a thrath of them, though, far. And I must go home in a few days. I believe Miss Egan said you lived in Des Moines. Yes. I can't that. In business there? Inquired John Quincy nonchalantly. Yes. Whole fall grocery buttoneth, answered Mr. Saladin. Slowly, but not very successfully. John Quincy turned away to hide a smile. Shall we go along? He said to the girl, Good luck to you, sir. He dove off, and as they swam toward the shore, he reflected that they were on a false trail there, a trail as spurious as the teeth. That little businessman was too conventional a figure to have any connection with the murder of Dan Winterslip. He kept these thoughts to himself, however. Halfway to the beach, they encountered an enormous figure floating languidly on the water. Just beyond the great stomach, John Quincy perceived the serene face of Charlie Chan. "Hello, Charlie," he cried. "It's a small ocean, after all. Got your Ford with you?" Chan righted himself and grinned. "Little pleasant recreation," he explained. "Forget detective worries out here floating idle like leaf on stream." "Please float ashore," suggested John Quincy. "I have something to tell you." "Only too happy," agreed Chan. He followed them in, and they sat, an odd trio, on the white sand. John Quincy told the detective about Saladin's activities outside the window the night before, and repeated the conversation that he had just had with the Middle Westerner. "Of course, the man seems almost too foolish to mean anything," he added. Chan shook his head. "Begging most humble pardon," he said, "but a wrong attitude completely. Detective business made up of insignificant trifles. One after other, our clues go burst in our countenance. Wise to pursue matter of Miss Saladin. What do you suggest?" John Quincy asked. "Tonight, I visit city for night work to drive off my piled tasks," Chan replied. "After evening meal, suggest you join with me at cable office. We dispatch message to postmaster of this Des Moines, inquiring what a present locality of Mr. Saladin, expert in wholesaling provisions. Your name will be signed to message, much better than police meddling." "All right," John Quincy agreed. "I'll meet you there at 8:30. Carlota Egan rose. "You know, I must get back to the reef in Palm. You've no idea. All I have to do." John Quincy stood beside her. "If I can help, you know." "I know." She smiled. "I'm thinking of making you assistant manager. They'd be so proud of you. In Boston." She moved off toward the water for her homeward swim, and John Quincy dropped down beside Chan. The Chinaman's little amber eyes followed the girl. "Endeavoring to make English language my slave," he said. "I pursue poetry. Who were the great poet who said, 'She walks in beauty like the night'?" "Why, that was..." remarked John Quincy helpfully. "Name is slippery," went on Chan, "but no matter. Lines pop into brain whenever I see this Miss Egan. Beauty like the night, Hawaiian night maybe, lovely as purest jade. Most especially on this beach, spot of heartbreaking charm. This beach surely is," agreed John Quincy, amused at Chan's obviously sentimental mood. "Here, on gleaming sand, I first regard my future life," continued Chan. "Slender as the bamboo is slender, beautiful as blossom of the plum." "Your wife," repeated John Quincy. The idea was a new one. "Yes, indeed." Chan rose. "Recalls I must hasten home, where she attends the children who are now, by actual count, 9 in number." He looked down at John Quincy thoughtfully. "Are you well fitted with the armor of preparation?" He said, "Consider, some night the moon has splendor in this neighborhood. The cocoa palms bow lowly and turn away their heads so they do not see. And the white man kisses without intending to do so." "Oh, don't worry about me," John Quincy laughed. "I'm from Boston and immune." "Immune?" repeated Chan. "Ah, yes," I grasped, meaning. "In my home, I have idol brought from China, with insides of solid stone. He would think he is immune. But even so, I would not entrust him on this beach. As my cousin Willie Chan say with vulgarity, see you later." John Quincy sat for a time on the sand, then rose and strolled towards home. His path lay close to the lanai of Arlene Compton's cottage. and he was surprised to hear his name called from behind the screen. He stepped to the door and looked in. The woman was sitting there alone. "Come in a minute, Mr. Winterslip," she said. John Quincy hesitated. He did not care to make any social calls on this lady, but he did not have it in him to be rude. He went inside and sat down gingerly, poised for flight. "Gotta hurry back for dinner," he explained. "Dinner? You'll want a cocktail." "No, thanks. I'm on the wagon. You'll find it hard to stick out here," she said a little bitterly. "I won't keep you long. I just want to know, are those boneheads down at the station getting anywhere, or ain't they?" The police smiled John Quincy. "They seem to be making progress, but it's slow. It's very slow. I'll tell the world it's slow, and I got to stick here till they pin it on somebody. Pleasant outlook, ain't it?" "Is Mr. Leatherby still with you?" inquired John Quincy. "What do you mean, is he still with me?" she flared. "Pardon me. Is he still in town?" "Of course he's in town. They won't let him go either. But I ain't worrying about him. I got troubles of my own. I want to go home." She nodded toward a newspaper on the table. "I just got hold of an old variety and seen about a show opening in Atlantic City. A lot of the gang is in it, working like dogs, rehearsing night and day, worrying themselves, sick over how long the thing will last. Gee, don't I envy them. I was near to bawling when you came along." "You'll get back all right," comforted John Quincy. "Say, if I ever do, I'll stop everybody I meet on Broadway and promise never to leave 'em again." John Quincy rose. "You tell that guy Howitt to get a move on," she urged. "I'll tell him," he agreed. "And drop in to see me now and then," she added wistfully. "Us Easterners ought to stick together out here." "That's right. We should," John Quincy answered. "Goodbye." As he walked along the beach, he thought of her with pity. The story she and Leatherby had told might be entirely false. Even so, she was a human and appealing figure, and her homesickness touched his heart. Later that evening, when John Quincy came downstairs, faultlessly attired for dinner, he encountered Amos Winterslip in the living room. Cousin Amos's lean face was whiter than ever, his manner listless. He had been robbed of his hate. His evenings beneath the algaroba tree had lost their savor. Life was devoid of spice. Dinner was not a particularly jolly affair. Arver seemed intent on knowing now the details of the search the police were conducting, and it fell to John Quincy to enlighten her. Reluctantly, he came at last to the story of Braid. She listened in silence. After dinner, she and John Quincy went out into the garden and sat on a bench under the haw tree, facing the water. "I'm terribly sorry I had to tell you that about Braid," John Quincy said gently, "but it seemed necessary." "Of course," she agreed. "Poor Dad. He was weak.
Forgive and forget," John Quincy suggested.
Man is a creature of environment. He wondered dimly where he had heard that before. "Your father was not entirely to blame. You're terribly kind, John Quincy," she told him. "No, but I mean it," he protested. "Just picture the scene to yourself. That lonely ocean, wealth at his feet for the taking. No one to see or know." She shook her head. "Oh, but it was wrong. Poor Mr. Braid. I must make things right with him as nearly as I can. I shall ask Harry to talk with him tomorrow." "Just a suggestion," interposed John Quincy. "Whatever you agree to do for Braid must not be done until the man who killed your father is found." She stared at him. "What?" You don't think that, Braid? I don't know. Nobody knows. Braid is unable to prove where he was early last Tuesday morning. They sat silent for a moment. Then the girl suddenly collapsed and buried her face in her hands. Her slim shoulders trembled convulsively, and John Quincy, deeply sympathetic, moved closer. He put his arm about her. The moonlight shone on her bright hair. The trades whispered in the hall tree. The breakers murmured on the beach. She lifted her face, and he kissed her. A cousinly kiss he had meant it to be, but somehow it wasn't. It was a kiss he would never have been up to on Beacon Street. Miss Minerva said I'd find you here, remarked a voice behind them. John Quincy leaped to his feet and found himself staring into the cynical eyes of Harry Jennison. Even though you are the girl's cousin, it is a bit embarrassing to have a man find you kissing his fiancée, particularly if the kiss wasn't at all cousinly. John Quincy wondered if Jennison had noticed that. Sit down, stammered John Quincy. I was just going. Goodbye, said Jennison coldly. John Quincy went hastily through the living room, where Miss Minerva sat with Amos. Got an appointment downtown, he explained, and picking up his hat in the hall, fled into the night. He had intended taking the roadster, but to reach the garage, he would have to pass that bench under the haw tree. Oh, well, the colorful atmosphere of a trolley was more interesting anyhow. In the cable office on the ground floor of the Alexander Young Hotel, Chan is waiting, and they sent off their inquiry to the postmaster at Des Moines, signing John Quincy's name and address. That attended to. They returned to the street. In the park across the way, an unseen group of young men strummed steel guitars and sang in soft, haunting voices. It was the only sign of life in Honolulu. Kindly deign to enter hotel lobby with me, suggested Chan. Is my custom to regard names and register from time to time. At the cigar stand, just inside the door, the boy paused to light his pipe, while Chan went on to the desk. As John Quincy turned, he saw a man seated alone in the lobby. A handsome, distinguished man who wore immaculate evening clothes that bore the stamp of Bond Street. An old acquaintance, Captain Arthur Temple Cope. At sight of John Quincy, Cope leaped to his feet and came forward. Hello, I'm glad to see you, he cried, with a cordiality that had not been evident at former meeting. Come over and sit down. John Quincy followed him. Aren't you back rather soon? He inquired. Sooner than I expected, Cope rejoined. Not sorry either. Then you didn't care for your little flock of islands? My boy, you should visit there. 35 white men, 250 natives, and a cable station. Jolly place of an evening. What? Chan came up, and John Quincy presented him. Captain Cope was the perfect host. Sit down, both of you, he urged. Have a cigarette. He extended a silver case. Thanks, I'll stick to the pipe, John Quincy said. Chan gravely accepted a cigarette and lighted it. Tell me, my boy, Cope said when they were seated. Is there anything new on the Winterslip murder? Haven't run down the guilty man, by any chance? No, not yet, John Quincy replied. That's a great pity. I understand the police are holding a chat named... Yes, Jim Egan of the Reef and Palm Hotel. Just what evidence have they against Egan, Mr. Winterslip? John Quincy was suddenly aware of Chant looking at him in a peculiar way. Oh, they dug up several things, he answered vaguely. Mr. Chan, you are a member of the police force, Captain Cope went on. Perhaps you can tell me. Chan's little eyes narrowed. Such matters are not yet presented to public. Ah, yes, naturally. Captain Cope's tone suggested disappointment. You have interest in this murder, I think? Chan said. Why, yes. Everyone out this way is puzzling about it. I fancy. The thing has so many angles. Is it possible that you were an acquaintance with Mr. Dan Winterslip? The detective persisted. I knew him slightly, but that was many years ago. Chan stood, humbly begging pardon to be so abrupt, he said. He turned to John Quincy.
The moment of our appointment is imminent. Of course, agreed John Quincy.
See you again, Captain. Perplexed, he followed Chan to the street. What appointment? He began, and stopped. Chan was carefully extinguishing the light of the cigarette against the stone facade of the hotel. That done, he dropped the stub into his pocket. You will see, he promised. First, we visit police station. As we journey, kindly relate all known facts concerning this Captain Cope. John Quincy told of his first meeting with Cope in the San Francisco Club and repeated the conversation as he recalled it. Evidence of warm dislike for Dan Winterslip were not to be concealed. Inquired Chan. Oh, quite plain, Charlie. He certainly had no love for Cousin Dan. But what? Immediately, he was leaving for Hawaii. Pardon the interrupt. Does it happily chance you know his date of arrival here? I do. I saw him in the Alexandrian Hotel last Tuesday evening when I was looking for you. He was rushing off to the Fanning Islands. We told me he had gotten the previous day at noon. Monday noon to put up Lisabeth. Yes, Monday noon. But Charlie, what are you trying to get at? Groping about, Chan smiled. Seeking to seize truth in my hot hands. They walked on in silence to the station, where Chan led the way into the deserted room of Captain Howard. He went directly to the safe and opened it. From a drawer, he removed several small objects, which he carried over to the captain's table. Property, Mr. Jin Egan, he announced, and laid a case of tarnished silver before John Quincy. Open it. What do you find now? Some Corsican cigarettes. He set down another exhibit, tin box, found in room of Mr. Braid. Open that also. You find more Corsican cigarettes. He removed an envelope from his pocket and taking out a charred stub, laid that too on the table. Fragment found by walk outside door of Dan Winterslip's mansion. He elucidated. Also Corsican brand. Frowning deeply, he removed a second charred stud from his pocket and laid it some distance from the other exhibits. Cigarette offered just now with winning air of hospitality by Captain Arthur Temple Cope. Lean close and perceive. More Corsican brand. Good Lord. John Quincy cried. Can it be you are familiar with these Corsicans? Inquired Chan. Not at all. I am more happily located. This afternoon, before the swim, I pause at public library for listless reading. An Australian newspaper. I encounter advertising. Talk of Corsican cigarette. It are assembled in two distinct fashions. One, labeled on tin 222, holds Turkish tobacco. Note 222 on tin of braid. Other labeled 444, made up from Virginia leaves. Is it that you are clever to know difference between Turkish and Virginia tobacco? Well, I think so, began John Quincy. Same with me, but thinking are not enough now. The moment are serious. We will interrogate expert opinion. Honor me by a journey to smoking emporium. He took a cigarette from Brack's tin, put it in an envelope, and wrote something on the outside, then did the same with one from Evian's case. The two stugs were similarly classified. They went in silence to the street. John Quincy, amazed by this new turn of events, told himself the idea was absurd. But Chan's face was grave, his eyes awake and eager. John Quincy was vastly more amazed when they emerged from the tobacco shop after a brisk interview with the young man in charge. Chan was jubilant now. Again, we advance. Here he tells us, cigarette from Braid's tin and little brother from Egan's case are of identical contents, both being of Turkish tobacco. Stub found near Walk are of Virginia stuff. So also are remnant received by me from the cordial hand of Captain Arthur Temple Cope. It's beyond me, replied John Quincy. By gad, that lets Egan out. Great news for Carlotta. I'll hurry to the reef and palm and tell her. Oh no, no, protested Chan. Please to let that happy moment wait. For the present, indulge only in silence. Before asking Captain Cope for a statement, we spy over his every move. Much may be revealed by the unsuspecting. I go to station to make arrangements.
But the man's a gentleman, John Quincy cried.
A captain in the British Admiralty. What you suggest is impossible. Chan shook his head. Impossible in Rear Bay at Boston, he said, but here at Morley Crossroads of Pacific, not so much so. 25 years of my life are consumed in Hawaii, and I have many times been witness when the impossible roused itself and occurred. Chapter 17. Nightlife in Honolulu. Monday brought no new developments, and John Quincy spent a restless day. Several times he called Chan at the police station, but the detective was always out. Honolulu, according to the evening paper, was agag, because this was not, as John Quincy learned to his surprise, a reference to the Winterslip case. An American fleet had just left the harbor of San Pedro, bound for Hawaii. This was the annual cruise of the graduating class at Onopolis. The warships were overflowing with future captains and admirals. They would linger at the port of Honolulu for several days, and a gay round of social events impended. Dinners, dances, moonlight swimming parties. John Quincy had not seen Barbara all day. The girl had not appeared at breakfast and had lunched with a friend down the beach. They met at dinner, however, and it seemed to him that she looked more tired and wet than ever. She spoke about the coming of the warships. It's always such a happy time, she said wistfully. The town simply blooms with handsome boys in uniform. I don't like to have you miss all the parties. John Quincy, you're not seeing Honolulu at its best. Why? That's all right, John Quincy assured her. She shook her head. Not with me. You know, we're not such slaves to convention out here. If I should get you a few invitations, what do you think, Cousin Minerva? I'm an old woman, said Miss Minerva. According to the standards of your generation, I suppose it would be quite the thing. But it's not the sort of conduct I can view approvingly. Now, in my day, don't you worry, Barbara, John Quincy broke in. Parties mean nothing to me. Speaking of old women, I'm an old man myself, 30 my next birthday. Just my pipe and slippers by the fire, or the electric fan. That's all I ask of life now. She smiled and dropped the matter. After dinner, she followed John Quincy to the lanai. I want you to do something for me, she began. Anything you say. Have a talk with Mr. Braid, and tell me what he wants. Why? I thought that Jennison, said John Quincy. No, I didn't ask him to do it, she replied. For a long moment, she was silent. I ought to tell you, I'm not going to marry Mr. Jennison after all. A shiver of apprehension ran down John Quincy's spine. Good Lord. That kiss. Had she misunderstood? And he hadn't meant a thing by it. Just a cousinly salute. At least, that was what it had started out to be. Barbara was a sweet girl, yes, but a relative, a Winterslip, and relatives shouldn't marry, no matter how distant the connection. Then too there was Agatha. He was bound to Agatha by all the ties of honor. What had he got himself into anyhow? I'm awfully sorry to hear that, he said. I'm afraid I'm to blame.
Oh, no, she protested.
But surely Mr. Jennison understood. He knows we're related, and that what he saw last night meant nothing. He was rather proud of himself. Pretty neat the way he'd got that over. If you don't mind, Barbara said, I'd rather not talk about it anymore. Harry and I will not be married. Not at present, at any rate. And if you'll see Mr. Braid for me, I certainly will, John Quincy promised. I'll see him at once. He was glad to get away, for the moon was rising on that spot of heartbreaking charm. A fellow ought to be more careful, he reflected as he walked along the beach. Fit upon himself the armor of preparation. As Chan had said, strange impulses came to one here, in this far tropical land. To yield to them was weak. Complications would follow, as the night the day. Here was one now, Barbara and Jennison estranged, and the cause was clear. Well, he was certainly going to watch his step hereafter. On the far end of the Reef and Palms first floor balcony, Braid and his wife sat together in the dusk. John Quincy went up to them. May I speak with you, Mr. Braid? He said. The man looked up out of a deep reverie. Ah, yes, of course. I'm John Quincy Winterslip. We've met before. Oh, surely, sir. Braid rose and shook hands. My dear, he turned to his wife, but with one burning glance at John Quincy. The woman had fled. The boy tingled in Boston. A Winterslip was never snubbed. Well, Dan Winterslip had arranged it otherwise in Hawaii. Sit down, sir, said Braid, somewhat embarrassed by his wife's action. I've been expecting one of your name. Naturally. Will you have a cigarette, sir? John Quincy proffered his case, and when the cigarettes were lighted, seated himself at the man's side. I'm here, of course, in regard to that story you told Saturday night. Story? Flashed Braid. John Quincy smiled. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not questioning the truth of it, but I do want to say this, Mr. Braid. You must be aware that you will have considerable difficulty establishing your claim in a court of law. The 80s are a long time back. What you say may be true, Braid agreed. I'm relying more on the fact that a trial would result in some rather unpleasant publicity for the Winterslip family. Precisely, nodded John Quincy. I am here at the request of Miss Barbara Winterslip, who is Dan Winterslip's sole heir. She's a very fine girl, sir. I don't question that, cut in Braid impatiently. And if your demands are not unreasonable, John Quincy paused and leaned closer. Just what do you want, mister? Braid stroked those gray mustaches that drooped in saddened mood. No money, he said, can make good the wrong Dan Winterslip did. But I'm an old man, and it would be something to feel financially secure for the rest of my life. I'm not inclined to be grasping, particularly since Dan Winterslip has passed beyond my reach. There were £20,000 involved. I'll say nothing about interest. For more than 40 years. A settlement of $100,000 would be acceptable. John Quincy considered. I can't speak definitely for my cousin, he said, but to me that sounds fair enough. I have no doubt Barbara will agree to give you that sum. He saw the man's tired old eyes brighten in the semi-darkness. The moment the murderer of Dan Winterslip is found, he added quickly, What's that you said? Braid leaped to his feet. I say she'll very likely pay you when this mystery is cleared up. Surely you don't expect her to do so before that time. John Quincy rose too. I certainly do. Braid cried. Why look here? This thing may drag on indefinitely. What? I want England again. The Strand. Piccadilly. It's 25 years since I saw London. Wait. Damn it. Why should I wait? What's this murder to me? By gad, sir. He came close, erect, flaming. The son of Tom Braid, the blackbirder now. Do you mean to insinuate that I... John Quincy faced him calmly. I know we can't prove where you were early last Tuesday morning, he said evenly. I don't say that incriminates you, but I shall certainly advise my cousin to wait. I not care to see her in the position of having rewarded the man who killed her father. I'll fight, cried Braid. I'll take it to the courts. Go ahead, John Quincy said, but it will cost you every penny you've saved, and you may ruse in the end. Good night, sir. Good night, Braid answered, standing as his father might have stood on the Maid of Shiloh's deck. John Quincy had gone halfway down the balcony when he heard quick footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Braid. Braid the civil servant, the man who had labored 36 years in the oven of India, a beaten, helpless figure. You've got me, he said, laying a hand on John Quincy's arm. I can't fight. I'm too tired, too old. I've worked too hard? I'll take whatever your cousin wants to give me when she's ready to give it. That's a wise decision, sir, Tom Quincy answered. A sudden feeling of pity gripped his heart. He felt toward Braid, as he had felt toward that other exile, Arlene Compton. I hope you see London very soon, he added and held out his hand. Braid took it. Thank you, my boy. You're a gentleman, even if your name is Winterslip. Which, John Quincy reflected as he entered the lobby of the Reef and Palm, was a compliment not without its flaw. He didn't worry over that long, however, for Carlotta Egan was behind the desk. She looked up and smiled, and it occurred to John Quincy that her eyes were happier than he had seen them their friends on the Oakland ferry. Hello, he said. Got a job for a good bookkeeper? He shook her head. Not with business, the way it is now. I was just figuring my payroll. You know, we've no undertow at Waikiki, but all my life I've had to worry about the overhead. He laughed. You talk like a brother companion. By the way, has anything happened? You seem considerably cheered. I am, she replied. I went to see poor Dad this morning in that horrible place, and when I left someone else was going in to visit him. A stranger. A stranger? Yes, and the handsomest thing you ever saw. Tall, gray, capable looking. He had such a friendly air, too. I felt better the moment I saw him. Who was he? John Quincy inquired, with sudden interest. I'd never seen him before, but one of the men told me he was Captain Cope of the British Admiralty. Why should Captain Cope want to see your father? I haven't a notion. Do you know him? Yes, I've met him, John Quincy told her. Don't you think he's wonderful looking? Her dark eyes glowed. He's all right, replied John Quincy, without enthusiasm. You know, I can't help feeling that things are looking up for you. I feel that too, she said. What do you say we celebrate? He suggested. Go out among them and get a little taste of nightlife. I'm a bit fed up on the police station. What do people do here in the evening? The movies. Just at present, the girl told him, everybody visits Punahou to see the night blooming cereus. It's the season now, you know. Sounds like a big evening, John Quincy laughed. Go and look at the flowers. Well, I'm for it. Will you come? Of course. She gave a few directions to the clerk and joined him by the door. I can run down and get the roadster, he offered. Oh no, she smiled. I'm sure I'll never own a motor car, and it might make me discontented to ride in one. The trolley's my carriage, and it's lots of fun. Carriage. Rap. One meets so many interesting people. On the stone walls surrounding the campus of Oahu College, the strange flower that blooms only on a summer night was heaped in snowy splendor. John Quincy had been a bit lukewarm regarding the expedition when they set out, but he saw his error now, for here was beauty breathtaking and rare. Before the walls paraded a throng of sightseers. They joined the procession. The girl was a charming companion. Her spirits had revived, and she chatted vivaciously, not about Shaw and the art galleries, true enough, but bright human talk that John Quincy liked to hear. He persuaded her to go to the city for a maidenly ice cream soda, and it was 10 o'clock when they returned to the beach. They left the trolley at a stop some distance down the avenue from the reef and palm and strolled slowly toward the hotel. The sidewalk was lined at their right by dense foliage, almost impenetrable. The night was calm. The street lamps shone brightly. The paved street gleamed white in the moonlight. John Quincy was talking of Boston. I think you'd like it there. It's old and settled, but say, from the foliage beside them came the flash of a pistol, and John Quincy heard a bullet sing close to his head. Another flash? Another bullet? The girl gave a startled little cry. John Quincy circled round her and plunged into the bushes. Angry branches stung his cheek. He stopped. He couldn't leave the girl alone. He returned to her side. What did that mean? He asked, amazed. He stared in wonder at the peaceful scene before him. I don't know. She took his arm. Come, hurry. Don't be afraid, he said reassuringly. Not for myself, she answered. They went on to the hotel, greatly puzzled. But when they entered the lobby, they had something else to think about. Captain Arthur Temple Cope was standing by the desk, and he came at once to meet them. This is Miss Egan, I believe. Winterslip. How are you? He turned again to the girl. I've taken a room here, if you don't mind. Why? Not at all, she gasped. I talked with your father this morning. I didn't know about his trouble until I had boarded a ship for the Fanning Islands. I came back as quickly as I could. You came back? She stared at him. Yes. I came back to help him. That's very kind of you, the girl said. But I'm afraid I don't understand. Oh, no. You don't understand. Naturally. The captain smiled down at her. You see, Jim's my young brother. You're my niece, and your name is Carlota Maria Cope. I fancy I've persuaded old Jim to own up to us at last. The girl's dark eyes were wide. I think you're a very nice uncle, she said at last. Do you really? The captain bowed. I aim to be, he added. John Quincy stepped forward. Pardon me, he said. I'm afraid I'm intruding. Good night, Captain. Good night, my boy, Cope answered. The girl went with John Quincy to the balcony. I don't know what to make of it, she said. Things are coming rather fast, John Quincy admitted. He remembered the Corsican cigarette. I wouldn't trust him too far, he admonished. But he's so wonderful. Oh, he's all right, probably. But looks are often deceptive. I'll go along now and let you talk with him. She laid one slim, tanned hand on his white-clad arm. Do be careful. Oh, I'm all right, he told her. But someone shot at you. Yes, and a very poor aim he had too. Don't worry about me. She was very close, her eyes glowing in the dark. You said you weren't afraid for yourself, he added. Did you mean? I meant I was afraid for you. The moon, of course, was shining. The cocoa palms turned their heads away at the suggestion of the trades. The warm waters of Waikiki murmured nearby different. John Quincy Winterslip from Boston and Immune drew the girl to him and kissed her. Not a cousinly kiss, either, but why should it have been? She wasn't his cousin. Thank you, my dear, he said. He seemed to be floating dizzily in space. It came to him that he might reach out and pluck her a handful of stars. It came to him a second later that, despite his firm resolve, he had done it again. Kissed another girl. 3.
That made 3 with whom he was sort of entangled.
Good night, he said huskily, and leaping over the rail, fled hastily through the garden. 3 girls now, but he hadn't a single regret. He was living at last. As he hurried through the dark along the beach, his heart was light. Once he fancied he was being followed, but he gave it little thought. What of it? On the bureau in his room, he found an envelope with his name typewritten on the outside. The note within was typewritten too. He read, "You're too busy out here. Hawaii can manage her affairs without the interference of the Kwanarmine. Outsail almost daily. If you are still here 48 hours after you get this, look out. Tonight's shots were fired into the air. The inn will quickly improve." Delighted, John Quincy tossed the note aside. Threatening him, eh? His activities as a detective were bearing fruit. He recalled the glowering face of Kaala when he said, "You did this. I don't forget." And a remark of Dan Winterslip's his aunt had quoted, "Civilized, yes, but far underneath there are deep, dark waters flowing still." Boats were sailing almost daily, were they? Well, let them sail. He would be on one someday, but not until he had brought Dan Winterslip's murderer to justice. Life had a new glamour now. Look out. He'd be looking and enjoying it too. He smiled happily to himself as he took off his coat. This was better than selling bonds in Boston. Chapter 18. A cable from the mainland. John Quincy awoke at 9 the following morning and slipped from under his mosquito netting, eager to face the responsibilities of a new day. On the floor in his bureau lay the letter designed to speed the parting guest. He picked it up and read it again with manifest enjoyment. When he reached the dining room, Haku informed him that Miss Minerva and Barbara had breakfasted early and gone to the city on a shopping tour. "Look here, Haku," the boy said. "A letter came for me late last night." "Yes, admitted Haku. "Who delivered it?" "Cannot say. It were found on floor of hall close by big front door." "Who found it?" "Tamaiku." "Oh, yes, Kamaikili. I tell her to put in your sleeping room." "Did Kamaikili see the person who brought it?" "Nobody see him." Nobody on place. All right, John Quincy said. He spent a leisurely hour on the lanai with his pipe and the morning paper. At about 10:30, he got out the roadster and drove to the police station. Hallett and Shan, he was told, were in a conference with the prosecutor. Hallett, he sat down to wait, and in a few moments, word came for him to join them. Entering Green's office, he saw the 3 men seated gloomily about the prosecutor's desk. "Well, I guess I'm some detective," he announced. Green looked up quickly. "Found anything new?" "Not precisely," John Quincy admitted. "But last night, when I was walking along Kalakaua Avenue with the young woman, somebody took a couple of wild shots at me from the bushes. And when I got home, I found this letter waiting." He handed the epistle to Howard, who read it with evident disgust, then passed it on to the prosecutor. "That doesn't get us anywhere," the captain said. "It may get me somewhere, if I'm not careful," John Quincy replied. "However, I'm rather proud of it. Sort of goes to show that my detective work is hitting home." "Maybe," answered Howard. Carelessly, Green laid the letter on his desk. "My advice to you," he said, "is to carry a gun." "That's unofficial, of course." "Nonsense. I'm not afraid," John Quincy told him. "I've got a pretty good idea you sent this thing." "You have," Green said. "Yes. He's a friend of Captain Howard's. Dick Canoes." "What do you mean he's a friend of mine?" flared Howard. "Well, you certainly treated him pretty tenderly the other night." "I knew what I was doing," said Howard gratefully. "I hope you did. But if you put a bullet in me some lovely evening, I'm going to be pretty annoyed with you." "Oh, you're in no danger," Howard answered. "Only a coward writes anonymous letters." "Yes, and only a coward shoots from ambush. But that isn't saying he can't take a good aim." Howard picked up the letter. "I'll keep this. It may prove to be evidence." "Surely," agreed John Quincy. "And you haven't got any too much evidence, as I see it." "Is that so?" growled Howard. "We've made a rather important discovery about that Corsican cigarette. And oh, I'm not saying Charlie isn't dead," smiled John Quincy. "I was with him when he worked that out." A uniformed man appeared at the door. "Egan and his daughter and Captain Cope," he announced to Green. "Want to see him now, sir?" "Send them in," ordered the prosecutor. "I'd like to stay, if you don't mind," John Quincy suggested. "Oh, by all means," Green answered. "We couldn't get along without you." The policeman brought Egan to the door, and the proprietor of the Reef and Palm came into the room. His face was haggard and pale. His long siege with the authorities had begun to tell, but a stubborn light still flamed in his eyes. After him came Carlotta Egan, fresh and beautiful, and with a new air of confidence about her. Captain Cope followed, tall, haughty, a man of evident power and determination. "This is the prosecutor, I believe," he said. "Ah, Mr. Winterslip, I find you everywhere I go. You don't mind my staying?" inquired John Quincy. "Not in the least, my boy. Our business here will take but a moment." He turned to Green. "Just as a preliminary," he continued, "I am Captain Arthur Temple Cope of the British Admiralty, and this gentleman," he nodded toward the proprietor of the Reef and Palm, "is my brother." "Egan?" said Green. "His name is Egan, as I understand it." "His name is James Egan Cope," the captain replied. "He dropped the Cope many years ago, for reasons that do not concern us now. I am here simply to say, sir, that you are holding my brother on the flimsiest pretext I have ever encountered in the course of my rather extensive travels. If necessary, I propose to engage the best lawyer in Honolulu and have him free by night. But I'm giving you this last chance to release him and avoid a somewhat painful expose of the sort of nonsense you go in for. John Quincy glanced at Karada Egan. Her eyes were shining, but not on him. They were on her uncle. Green flushed slightly. A good bluff, Captain, is always worth trying, he said. Oh, then you admit you've been bluffing, said Cope quickly. I was referring to your attitude, sir, Green replied. Oh, I see, Cope said. I'll sit down, if you don't mind. As I understand it, you have two things against old Jim here. One is that he visited Dan Winterslip on the night of the murder, and now refuses to divulge the nature of that call. The other is the stub of a Corsican cigarette, which was found by the watch outside the door of Winterslip's living room. Green shook his head. Only the first, he responded. The Corsican cigarette is no longer evidence against Eden. He leaned suddenly across his desk. It is, my dear Captain Cope, evidence against you. Cope met his look unflinchingly. Really? He remarked. Tom Quincy noted a flash of startled bewilderment in Carlotta Eden's eyes. That's what I said, Green continued. I'm very glad you dropped in this morning, sir. I've been wanting to talk to you. I've been told that you were heard to express a strong dislike for Dan Winterslip. I may have. I certainly felt it. Why? And as a midshipman on a British warship, I was familiar with Australian gossip in the 80s. Mr. Dan Winterslip had an unsavory reputation. It was rumored on good authority that he rifled the sea chest of his dead captain on the Maid of Shiloh. Perhaps we're a bit squeamish, but that is the sort of thing we sailors cannot forgive. There were other point deeds in connection with his blackbirding activity. Yes, my dear sir, I heartily disliked Dan Winterslip, and if I haven't said so before, I say it now. You arrived in Honolulu a week ago yesterday, Green continued. At noon, Monday. You left the following day. Did you by any chance call in Dan Winterslip during that period? I did not. Yeah. I may tell you, sir, that the Corsican cigarettes found in Egan's case were of Turkish tobacco. The stub found near the scene of Dan Winterslip's murder was of Virginia tobacco. So also, my dear Captain Cope, was the Corsican cigarette you gave our man Charlie Chan in the lobby of the Alexander Young Hotel last Sunday night. Cope looked at Chan and smiled. Always the detective there, he said. Never mind that. Green cried. I'm asking for an explanation. The explanation is very simple, Cope replied. I was about to get it to you when you launched into this silly cross-examination. The Corsican cigarette found by Dan Winterslip's door was naturally of Virginia tobacco. I never smoke any other kind. What? There can be no question about it, sir. I dropped that cigarette there myself. But you just told me you didn't call on Dan Winterslip. That was true. I didn't. I called on Miss Minerva Winterslip of Boston, who was a guest in the house. As a matter of fact, I had tea with her last Monday at 5 o'clock. You may verify that by telephoning the lady. Green glanced at Howlett, who glanced at the telephone, then turned angrily to John Quincy. Why the devil didn't she tell me that? He demanded. John Quincy smiled. I don't know, sir. Possibly because she never thought of Captain Cope in connection with the murder. She'd hardly be likely to, Cope said. Miss Winterslip and I had tea in the living room, then went out and sat on a bench in the garden, chatting over old times. When I returned to the house, I was smoking a cigarette. I dropped it just outside the living room door. Whether Miss Winterslip noted my action or not, I don't know. She probably didn't. It isn't the sort of thing one remembers. You may call her on the telephone if you wish, sir. Again, Green looked at Howitt, who shook his head. I'll talk with her later, announced the captain of detectives. Evidently, Miss Minerva had an unpleasant interview ahead. At any rate, the bill Cope continued to the prosecutor. You had yourself disposed of the cigarette as evidence against old Jim. That leaves only the fact of his silence. His silence? Yes, Green cut in. And the fact that Winterslip had been heard to express a fear of Jim even. Cope frowned. Had he, really? He considered a moment. Well, what of it? Winterslip had good reason to fear a great many honest men. No, my dear sir, you have nothing, save my brother's silence against him, and that is not enough. I demand... Green maced his hand. Just a minute. I said you were bluffing, and I still think so. Any other assumption would be an insult to your intelligence. Sherlock, you know enough about the law to understand that your brother's refusal to tell me his business with Winterslip, added to the fact that he was presumably the last person to see Winterslip alive, is sufficient excuse for holding him. I can hold him on those grounds. I am holding him. And, my dear captain, I shall continue to hold him until hell freezes over. Very good, said Cope, rising. I shall engage a capable lawyer. That is, of course, your privilege, snapped Green. Good morning. Cope hesitated. He turned to Egan. It means more publicity, Jim, he said. Delay, too. More unhappiness for Carlotta here. And since everything you did was done for her, how do you know that? Asked Egan quickly. I've guessed it. I can put two and two together, Jim. Carlotta was to return with me for a bit of schooling in Emo. You said you had the money, but you hadn't. And that was your pride again, Jim. It's got you into a lifetime of trouble. You cast about for the funds, and you remembered Winterslip. I'm beginning to see it all now. You had something on Dan Winterslip, and you went to his house that night to blackmail him, suggested Green. It wasn't a pretty thing to do, Jim, Cope went on. But you weren't doing it for yourself, Carlotta. And I know you would have died first. You did it for your girl, and we both forgive you. He turned to Carlotta. Don't we, my dear? The girl's eyes were wet. She rose and kissed her father. Dear old Dad, she said. Come on, Jim, pleaded Captain Cope. Forget your pride for once. Speak up, and we'll take you home with us. I'm sure the prosecutor will keep the thing from the newspapers. We've promised him that 1,000 times, Green said. Egan lifted his head. I don't care anything about the newspapers, he explained. It's you, Arthur. You and Carrie. I don't want you two to know. But since you've guessed, and Carrie knows too, I may as well tell everything. John Quincy stood up. Mr. Egan, he said, I'll leave the room if you wish. Sit down, my boy, Egan replied. Carrie's told me of your kindness to her. Besides, you saw the check. What check was that? Cried Howard. He leaped to his feet and stood over John Quincy. I was honor bound not to tell, explained the boy gently. You. Don't say so, Howard bellowed. You're a fine pair, you and that aunt of yours. 1 minute, Howard, cut in Green. Now, Egan, or Cope, or whatever your name happens to be, I'm waiting to hear from you. Egan nodded. Back in the 80s, I was teller in a bank in Northern Australia, he said. One day, the young man came to my window. Williams, or some such name he called himself. He had a green hide bag full of gold pieces. Mexican, Spanish, and English coins, some of them crusted with dirt, and he wanted to exchange them for banknotes. I made the exchange for him. He appeared several times with similar bags, and the transaction was repeated. I thought little of it at the time, though the fact that he tried to give me a large tip did rather arouse my suspicion. A year later, when I had left the bank and gone to Sydney, I heard rumors of what Dan Winterslip had done on the maid of Shiloh. It occurred to me that Williams and Winterslip were probably the same man, but no one seemed to be prosecuting the case. The general feeling was that it was blood money anyhow, that Tom Braid had not come by it honestly himself. So I said nothing. 12 years later, I came to Hawaii, and Dan Winterslip was pointed out to me. He was Williams, right enough, and he knew me, too. But I'm not a blackmailer. I've been in some tight places, Arthur, but I've always played fair. So I let the matter drop. And then, in separate in 20 years, we see how long. Then, a few months ago, my family located me at last, and Arthur here wrote me that he was coming to Honolulu and would look me up. I'd always felt that I'd not done the right thing by my girl, that she was not taking the place in the world to which she was entitled. I wanted her to visit my old mother and get a bit of English training. I wrote to Arthur, and it was arranged. But I couldn't let her go as a charity child. I couldn't admit I'd failed and was unable to do anything for her. I said I'd pay her way, and I didn't have a cent. And then Braid came. It seemed providential. I might have sold my information to him, but when I talked with him, I found he had very little money, and I felt that Winterslip would beat him in the end. Now, Winterslip is my man. Winterslip with his rotten wealth. I don't know just what happened. I was quite mad, I fancy. The world owed me that, I figured, just for my girl, not for me. I called Winterslip up and made an appointment for that Monday night. But somehow, the standards of a lifetime. It's difficult to change. The moment I had called him, I regretted it. I tried to slip out of it. I told myself, there must be some other way. Perhaps I could sell the wreath and palm. Anyhow, I called him again and said I wasn't coming. But he insisted, and I went. I didn't have to tell him what I wanted. He knew. He had a check ready for me, a check for $5,000. It was Carrie's happiness, her chance. I took it and came away, but I was ashamed. I'm not trying to excuse my action. However, I don't believe I would ever have cashed it. When Carrie found it in my desk and brought it to me, I tore it up. That's all. He turned his tired eyes toward his daughter. I did it for you, Carrie, but I didn't want you to know. She went over and put her arm about his shoulder and stood smiling down at him through her tears. If you told us that in the first place, said Green, you could have saved everybody a lot of trouble, yourself included. Cope stood up. Well, Mr. Carmel, prosecutor, there you are. You're not going to hold him now? Green rose briskly. No. I'll arrange for his release at once. He and Egan went out together, then Howitt and Cope. John Quincy held out his hand to Carlotta. Egan, for by that name he thought of her still. I'm mighty glad for you, he said. You'll come and see me soon, she asked. You'll find a very different girl, more like the one you met on the Oakland ferry. She was very charming, John Quincy replied. But then, she was bound to be. She had your eyes. He suddenly remembered Agatha Parker. However, you've got your father now, he added. You won't need me. She looked up at him and smiled. I wonder, she said. and went out. John Quincy turned to Chan. "Well, that's that," he remarked. "Where are we now?" "Speaking personally for myself," grinned Chan, "I am static in same place as usual. Never did have fondly feeling for Agan Deary, but Hella did," John Quincy answered. A black morning for him. In the small anteroom, they encountered the captain of detectives. He appeared disgruntled. "We were just remarking," said John Quincy presently, "that there goes your little old Egan theory." "What have you left?" "Oh, I've got plenty," growled Howard. "Yes, you have. One by one, your clues have gone up in smoke. The page from the guest book, the brooch, the torn newspaper, the Ohio word box, and now Egan and the Corsican cigarette." "Oh, Egan isn't out of it. We may not be able to hold him, but I'm not forgetting Mr. Egan." "Nonsense," smiled John Quincy. "I asked what you had left. Little button from a glove. Useless. The glove was destroyed long ago. A wristwatch with an illuminated dial and a damaged numeral 2. Chan's amber eyes narrowed. "Essential clue," he murmured. "Remember how I said it. Hallett banged his fist on a table. That's it. The wristwatch. If the person who wore it knows anyone saw it, it's probably where we'll never find it now. Oh, we've kept it pretty dark. Perhaps he doesn't know. That's our only chance." He turned to Chan. "I've combed these islands once hunting that watch," he cried. "I'm going to start all over again. The jewelry stores, the pawn shops, every nook and corner. You go out, Charlie, and start the ball rolling." Chan moved with alacrity despite his weight. "I will give it one powerful push," he promised, and disappeared. "Well, good luck," said John Quincy, moving on. Howard grunted. "You still first time. Tell you're safe. Your powers of aunt on pretty. Can you still, you truly perform?" He was not in the mood for elegance of diction. John Quincy's opportunity to deliver the message did not come at lunch, for Miss Minerva remained with Barbara in the city. After dinner that evening, he led his aunt out to sit on the bench under the haw tree. "By the way," he said, "Captain Hallett is very much annoyed with you." "I'm very much annoyed with Captain Hallett," she replied. "So that makes us even." "What's his particular grievance now?" "He believes you knew all the time the name of the man who dropped that Corsican cigarette." She was silent for a moment. "Not all the time," she said at length. "What has happened?" John Quincy sketched briefly the events of the morning at the police station. When he had finished, he looked at her inquiringly. "In the first excitement, I didn't remember, or I should have spoken," she explained. "It was several days before the thing came to me. I saw it clearly then, Arthur, Captain Cope, tossing that cigarette aside as we re-entered the house. But I said nothing about it." "Why?" "Well, I thought it would be a good test for the police. Let them discover it for themselves." "That's a pretty weak explanation," remarked John Quincy severely. "You've been responsible for a lot of wasted time." It wasn't my only reason," said Miss Minerva softly. "Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Go on." "Somehow I couldn't bring myself to link up that call of Captain Cope's with a murder mystery." Another silence. And suddenly, he was never dense, John Quincy understood. "He told me you were very beautiful in the 80s, said the boy gently. "The captain, I mean, when I met him in that San Francisco club." Miss Minerva laid her own hand on the boy's. When she spoke, her voice, which he had always thought firm and sharp, trembled a little. "On this beach in my girlhood," she said, "happiness was within my grasp. I had only to reach out and take it. But somehow, Boston held me back. I let my happiness slip away. Not too late yet, suggested John Quincy. She shook her head. So he tried to tell me that Monday afternoon, but there was something in his tone. I may be in Hawaii, but I'm not quite mad. Youth, John Quincy, youth, doesn't return, whatever they may say out here. She pressed his hand and stood. If your chance comes, dear boy, she added, don't be such a fool. She moved in hastily away through the garden, and John Quincy looked after her with a new affection in his eyes. Presently, he saw the yellow glare of a match beyond the wire. Amos, again, still loitering under his algarobel tree. John Quincy rose and strolled over to him. Hello, Cousin Amos, he said. When are you going to take down this fence? We'll go. Oh, I'll get round to it sometime, Amos answered. By the way, I wanted to ask you, any need developments? Several, John Quincy told him, but nothing that gets us anywhere. So far as I can see, the case has blown up completely. Well, I've been thinking it over, Amos said. Maybe that would be the best outcome, after all. Suppose they do discover who did Fergan. It may only reveal a new scandal, worse than any of the others. I'll take a chance on that, replied John Quincy. For my part, I intend to see this thing through. Hawker came briskly through the garden. Cable message for Mr. John Quincy Winterslip. Please say collect. Requests. Money. John Quincy followed quickly to the front door. A bored small boy awaited him. He paid the sum due and tore open the cable. It was signed by the postmaster at Des Moines, and it read, "No one named Saladin ever heard of here." John Quincy dashed to the telephone. Someone on duty at the station informed him that Chan had gone home and gave him an address on Conchbull Hill. He got out the roadster and in 5 minutes more was speeding toward the city. Chapter 19. Goodbye, Pete. Charlie Chan lived in a bungalow that clung precariously to the side of Punchbowl Hill. Pausing a moment at the Chinaman's Gate, John Quincy looked down on Honolulu, one great gorgeous garden set in an amphitheater of mountains. A beautiful picture, but he had no time for beauty in the area. He hurried up the brief walk that lay in the shadow of the palm trees. A Chinese woman, a servant, she seemed, ushered him into Chan's dimly lighted living room. The detective was seated at a table, playing chess. He rose with dignity when he saw his visitor. In this, his hour of ease, he wore a long, loose robe of dark purple silk, which fitted closely at the neck and had wide sleeves. Beneath it showed wide trousers of the same material, and on his feet were shoes of silk with thick felt soles. He was all Oriental now, suave and ingratiating but remote. And for the first time, John Quincy was really conscious of the great gulf across which he and Chen shook hands. "You do my lowly house immense honor," Charlie said. This proud moment are made still more proud by opportunity to introduce my eldest son. He motioned for his opponent at chess to step forward, a slim, sour boy with amber eyes, Chan himself, before he put on weight. Mr. John Quincy Winterslip of Boston, kindly condescend to notice Henry Chan. When you appear, I am giving him lesson at chess, so he may play in such manner as not to tarnish honored name. The boy bowed low. Evidently, he was one member of the younger generation who had a deep respect for his elders. John Quincy also bowed. "Your father is my very good friend," he said, "and from now on, you are too." Chan beamed with pleasure. "Condescend," to sit on the atrocious chair. Is it possible you bring news? It certainly is, smiled John Quincy. He handed over the message from the postmaster at Des Moines. Most interesting, said Chan.
Do I hear impressive chug of rich automobile engine in street?
Yes, I came in the car, John Quincy replied. Good. We will hasten at once to home of Captain Hallett, not far away. I beg of you to pardon my disappearance while I don more appropriate costume. Left alone with the boy, John Quincy sought a topic of conversation. Play baseball? He asked. The boy's eyes glowed. Not very good, but I hope to improve. My cousin Willie Chan is great expert at that game. He has promised to teach me. John Quincy glanced about the room. On the back wall hung a scroll with felicitations, a gift of some friend of the family at New Year's. Opposite him, on another wall, was a single picture painted on silk, representing a bird on an apple bow. Charmed by its simplicity, he went over to examine it. That's beautiful, he said, quoting old Chinese saying, a picture is a voiceless poem, replied the boy. Beneath the picture stood a square table, flanked by straight, low-backed armchairs. On other elaborately carved teakwood, stands distributed about the room were blue and white vases, porcelain wine jars, dwarfed trees. Pale golden lanterns hung from the ceiling. A soft-toned rug lay on the floor. John Quincy felt again the gulf between himself and Charlie Chan. But when the detective returned, he wore the conventional garb of Los Angeles or Detroit, and the gulf did not seem so wide. They went out together, and entering the roadster, drove to Hallett's house on Iolani Avenue. The captain lolled in pajamas on his lanai. He greeted his callers with interest. You boys are outweight, he said. Something doing? Certainly is, replied John Quincy, taking a proffered chair. There's a man named Saladin. At mention of the name, Hallett looked at him keenly. John Quincy went on to tell what he knew of Saladin, his alleged place of residence, his business, the tragedy of the lost teeth. Some time ago, we got on to the fact that every time Calla figured in the investigation, Saladin was interested. He managed to be at the desk of the reef upon the De Keola, inquired for Brave. On the night, Cower was questioned by your men. Miss Egan saw Mr. Saladin crouching outside the window. So Charlie and I thought it a good scheme to send a cable of inquiry to the postmaster at Des Moines, where Saladin claimed to be in the wholesale grocery business. He handed an envelope to Hallett. That answer arrived tonight, he added. An odd smile had appeared on Hallett's usually solemn face. He took the cable and read it, then slowly tore it into bits. Forget it, boys, he said calmly. What? Gasped John Quincy. I said forget it. I like your enterprise, but you're on the wrong trail, man. John Quincy was greatly annoyed. I demand an explanation, he cried. I can't give it to you, Hallett answered. You'll have to take my word for it. I've taken your word for a good many things, said John Quincy hotly. This begins to look rather suspicious to me. Are you trying to shield somebody? Hallett rose and laid his hand on John Quincy's shoulder. I've had a hard day, he remarked, and I'm not going to get angry with you. I'm not trying to shield anybody. I'm as anxious as you are to discover who killed Dan Winterslip. More anxious, perhaps. Yet when we bring you evidence, you tear it up. Bring me the right evidence, said Hallett. Oh, bring me that wristwatch. I can promise you action then. John Quincy was impressed by the sincerity in his tone, but he was sadly puzzled too. All right, he said, that's that. I'm sorry if we've troubled you with this trivial matter. Don't talk like that. Howard broke in. I'm glad of your help. But as far as Mr. Saladin is concerned, he looked at Chan. Let him alone. Chan bowed. You are undisputable chief, he replied. They went back to Punchbowl Hill and the Roadster, both rather dejected. As Chan alighted at his gate, John Quincy spoke. Well, I'm Pa. Saladin was my last hope. The Chinaman stared for a moment at the moonlit Pacific that lay beyond the waterfront lamps. Stone wall surround us, he said dreamily, but we circle about seeking loophole. The moment of discovery will come. I wish I thought so, replied John Quincy. Chan smiled. Patience are a very lovely virtue, he remarked. Seem that way to me. But maybe that are my oriental mind. Your race, I perceive, regard patience with ever-swelling disfavor. It was with swelling disfavor that John Quincy regarded it as he drove back to Waikiki. Yet he had great need of patience in the days immediately following, for nothing happened. The 48-hour period given him to leave Hawaii expired, but the writer of that threatening letter failed to come forward and relieve the tedium. Thursday arrived, a calm day like the others. Thursday night, peaceful and serene. On Friday afternoon, Agatha Parker broke the monotony by a cable sent from the Wyoming ranch. You must be quite mad. I find the West crude and impassable. John Quincy smiled. He could picture her as she wrote it. Proud, haughty, unyielding. She must have been popular with the man who transmitted the message. Or was he, too, an exile from the East? And perhaps the girl was right. Perhaps he was mad after all. He sat on Dan Winterslip's lanai, trying to think things out. Boston, the office, the art gallery, the theaters, the common, on a winter's day, with the air bracing and full of life. The thrill of a new issue of Bonds, like the thrill of the theatrical first night. Would it get over? Big will flop at his feet. Tennis at Longwood. Long evenings on the Charles. Golf with people of his own kind at Magnolia. Tea out of exquisite cups in dim old drawing rooms. Wasn't he mad to think of giving up all that? But what had Miss Minerva said? If your chance ever comes. The problem was a big one, and big problems were annoying out here, where the lotus grew. He yawned and went aimlessly downtown. Drifting into the public library, he saw Charlie Chan hunched over a table that held an enormous volume. John Quincy went closer. The book was made up of back numbers of the Honolulu morning paper, and it was open at a time-yellowed sporting page. Hello, Chan. What are you up to? The Chinaman gave him a smile of greeting. Hello. A little bit of careless reading while I gallop about seeking loophole. He closed the big volume. Casually. You seem in the best of health. Oh, I'm all right. No more fierce shots out of bushes. Had I trigger pulled. I imagine that was a big bluff. Nothing more. What do you say? Bluff. I mean, the fellow's a coward. After all, Chan shook his head solemnly. Pardon suggestion. Do not lose carefulness. Hotheads plenty and hot climate. I'll look before I leap, John Quincy promised. But I'm afraid I interrupted you. Ridiculous thought, protested Chen. I'll go along. Let me know if anything breaks. Most certainly. Up to present, everything are intact. John Quincy paused at the door of the reference room. Charlie Chan had promptly opened the big book and was again bending over it with every show of interest. Returning to Waikiki, John Quincy faced a dull evening. Barbara had gone to the island of Kauai for a visit with old friends of the family. He had not been sorry when she went, for he didn't feel quite at ease in her presence. The estrangement between the girl and Jennison continued. The lawyer had not been at the dock to see her off. Yes, John Quincy had parted from her gladly, but her absence cast a pall of loneliness over the house on Kalia Road. After dinner, he sat with his pipe on the lanai. Down the beach at the Reef and Palm, pleasant company was available, but he hesitated. But he had seen Carlota Egan several times by day, on the beach or in the water. He was very happy now, though somewhat appalled at thought of her approaching visit to England. They'd had several talks about that, daylight talks. John Quincy was a bit afraid to entrust himself, as Cham had said in speaking of his stone idol of an evening. After all, there was Agatha, there was Boston. There was Barbara, too. Being entangled with 3 girls at once was a rather wearing experience. He rose and went downtown to the movies. On Saturday morning, he was awakened early by the whir of airplanes above the house. The American fleet was in the offing, and the Lill brothers of the air service hastened out to hover overhead in friendly welcome. That day, a spirit of carnival prevailed in Honolulu. Flags floated from every masthead, and the streets bloomed, as Barbara had predicted, with handsome boys in spotless uniforms. They were everywhere, swarming in the souvenir stores, besieging the soda fountains, skylarking on the trolley cars. Evening brought a great ball at the beach hotel, and John Quincy, out for a walk, saw that every spick and span uniform moved toward Waikiki, accompanied by a fair young thing who was only too happy to serve as sweetheart in that particular port. John Quincy felt, suddenly, rather, out of things. Each pretty girl he saw were called Carlota Egan. He turned his wandering footsteps toward the Reef and Palm, and oddly enough, his pace quickened at once. The proprietor himself was behind the desk, his eyes calm and untroubled now. "Good evening, Mr. Egan. Or should I say Cope," remarked John Quincy. "Oh, we'll stick to the Egan, I guess," the man replied. Sort of got out of the hang of the other. "Mr. Winterslip, I'm happy to see you. Carrie will be down in a moment." John Quincy gazed about the big public room. It was a scene of confusion, spattered, ladders, buckets of paint, rolls of new wallpaper. "What's going on?" he inquired. "Freshening things up a bit," Beacon answered. "You know, we're in society now." He laughed. "Yes, sir. The old Reef and Palm has been standing here a long time, without so much as a glance from the better element of Honolulu. But now they know I'm related to the British Admiralty. They've suddenly discovered it's a quaint and interesting place. They're dropping in for tea. Just fancy. But that's Honolulu. That's Boston, too," John Quincy assured him. "Yes, and precisely the sort of thing I ran away from England to escape. A good many years ago. I'd tell them all to go to the devil. But there's Carrie. Somehow, women feel differently about those things. It will warm her heart a bit to have these dowagers smile upon her. And they're smiling. I mean, they've even dug up the fact that my cousin George has been knighted for making a particularly efficient brand of soap." He grimaced. "It's nothing I'd have mentioned myself. A family skeleton, as I see it. But society has odd standards, and I mustn't be hard on poor old George. Arthur says, making soap. Is your brother with you?" "No. He's gone back to finish his job in the Fanning Group. When he returns, I'm sending Carrie to England for a long stop." "Yes, that's right. I'm sending her," he added quickly. "I'm paying for these repairs too. You see, I've been able to add a second mortgage to The one already on the poor tottering reef and palm? That's another outcome of my newfound connection with the British Admiralty and the silly old soak business. Here's Carrie now. John Quincy turned, and he was glad he had, for he would not willingly have missed the picture of Carlotta on the stairs. Carlotta, in an evening gown of some shimmering material, her dark hair dressed in a new and amazingly effective way, her white shoulders gleaming, her eyes happy at last. As she came quickly toward him, he caught his breath. Never had he seen her look so beautiful. She must have heard his voice in the office, he reflected, and with surprising speed arrayed herself thus to greet him. He was deeply grateful as he took her hand. "Stranger," she rebuked, "you thought you deserted us." "I'd never do that," he answered, "but I've been rather busy." A step sounded behind him. He turned, and there stood one of those ubiquitous Navy boys, a tall, blonde Adonis who held his cap in his hand and smiled in a devastating way. "Hello, Johnny," Carlotta said. "Mr. Winterslip of Boston. This is Lieutenant Booth of Richmond, Virginia." "How are you?" nodded the boy, without removing his eyes from the girl's face. Like just one of the guests, this Winterslip, like no account at all. Such was obviously the lieutenant's idea. "All ready, Carrie? The car's outside." "I'm frightfully sorry, Mr. Winterslip," said the girl, "but we're off to the dance. This weekend belongs to the Navy, you know. You'll come again, won't you?" "Of course," John Quincy replied. "Don't let me keep you." She smiled at him and fled with Johnny at her side. Looking after them, John Quincy felt his heart sink to his boots, an unaccountable sensation of age and helplessness. Youth was going through that door, and he was left behind. "A great pity. She had to run," said Eden in a kindly voice. "Why, that's all right," John Quincy assured him. "Old friend of the family, this Lieutenant Booth?" "Not at all. Just a lad Carrie met at parties in San Francisco." "Won't you sit down and have a smoke with me?" "Some other time." "Thanks," John Quincy said warily. "I must hurry back to the house." He wanted to escape, to get out into the calm, lovely night, the night that he was ruined for him now. He walked along the beach, savagely kicking his toes into the light sand. Johnny. She had called him Johnny. And the way she had looked at him, too. Again, John Quincy felt that sharp pang in his heart. Foolish, foolish. Better go back to Boston and forget. Peaceful old Boston. That was where he belonged. He was an old man out here. 30. Better go away and leave these children to love and the moonlit beach. Miss Minerva had gone in the big car to call on friends, and the house was quiet as the tomb. John Quincy wandered aimlessly about the ruins, gloomy and bereft. Down at the Moana, an Hawaiian orchestra was playing, and Lieutenant Booth of Richmond was holding Carlotta close in the intimate manner affected these days by the young. If he hadn't been ordered to leave Hawaii, by gad, he'd go tomorrow. The telephone rang. None of the servants appeared to answer it, so John Quincy went himself. "Charlie Chan speaking," said a voice. "That is you, Mr. Winterslip? Good. Big events will come to pass very quick. E.E. Drug and Grocery Emporium of Lee Inn. Number 927 River Street. Soon as you can do so. You savvy locality? I'll find it," cried John Quincy, delighted. "By bank of stream. I will await. Goodbye." Action, action at last. John Quincy's heart beat fast. Action was what he wanted tonight. As usually happens in a crisis, there was no automobile available. The roadster was at a garage undergoing repairs, and the other car was in use. He hastened over to Kalakaua Avenue, intending to rent a machine, but a trolley, approaching at the moment, altered his plans, and he swung aboard. Never had a trolley moved at so reluctant a pace. When they reached the corner of Fort Street in the center of the city, he left it and proceeded on foot. The hour was put fairly early, but the scene was one of somnolent calm. A couple of tourists drifted aimlessly by. About the bright doorway of a shooting gallery loitered a group of soldiers from the fort, with a sprinkling of enlisted Navy men. John Quincy hurried on down King Street, past Chinese noodle cafes and pawn shops, and turned presently off into River Street. On his left was the river. On his right, an array of shabby stores. He paused at the door of number 927, the establishment of Lu Yin. Inside, seated behind a screen that revealed only their heads, a number of Chinese were engrossed in a friendly little ding. John Quincy opened the door. A bell tinkled, and he stepped into an odor of must and decay. Curious sights met his quick eye: dried roots and herbs, jars of seahorse skeletons, dejected ducks flattened out and varnished to tempt the palate, gobbets of pork. An old Chinaman rose and came forward. "I'm looking for Mr. Charlie Chan," said John Quincy. The old man nodded and led the way to a red curtain across the rear of the shop. He lifted it and indicated that John Quincy was to pass. The boy did so, and came into a bare room furnished with a cot, a table, on which an oil lamp burned dimly behind a smoky chimney, and a couple of chairs. A man who had been sitting on one of the chairs rose suddenly. A huge red-haired man, with the snow of the sea about him. "Hello," he said. "Is Mr. Chan here?" John Quincy inquired. "Not yet. He'll be along in a minute. But say to a drink, while we're waiting, hey, meal, a couple of glasses, that rotten rice wine." The Chinaman withdrew. "Sit down," said the man. John Quincy obeyed. The sailor sat too. One of his eyelids drooped wickedly. He rested his hands on the table. Enormous hairy hands. "Charlie, we'll be here pretty quick," he said. "Then I got a little story to tell the two of you." "Yes," John Quincy replied. He glanced about the little vile-smelling room. There was a door, a closed door, at the back. He looked again at the red-haired man. He wondered how he was going to get out of there, for he knew now that Charlie Chan had not called him on the telephone. It came to him belatedly that the voice was never Charlie's. "You savvy locality?" the voice had said, a clumsy attempt at Chan's style, but Chan was a student of English. He dragged his words painfully from the poets. He was careful to use nothing that savored of pigeon. No, the detective had not telephoned. He was no doubt at home now, bending over his chessboard. And here was John Quincy, shut up in a little room on the fringe of the river district with a husky sailorman who leered at him knowing. The old Chinaman returned with 2 small glasses, into which the liquor had already been poured. He set them on the table. The red-haired man lifted one of them. "Your health, sir," he said. John Quincy took up the other glass and raised it to his lips. There was a suspicious eagerness in the sailor's one good eye. John Quincy put the glass back on the table. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't want a drink, thank you." The great face with its stubble of red beard leaned close to his. "You mean you won't drink with me?" said the red-haired man belligerently. "That's just what I mean," John Quincy answered. Might as well get it over with, he felt. Anything was better than this suspense. He stood up. "I'll be going along," he announced. He took a step toward a red curtain. The sailor, evidently a fellow of few words, rose and got in his way. John Quincy himself, feeling the futility of talk, said nothing, but struck the man in the face. The sailor struck back with efficiency and promptness. In another second, the room was full of battle, and John Quincy saw red everywhere, red curtain, red hair, red lamp flame, great red hairy hands cunningly seeking his face. What was it Roger had said? Ever fought with a ship's officer, the old-fashioned kind, with fists like flying hams? No, he hadn't up to them, but that sweet experience was his now, and it came to John Quincy pleasantly that he was doing rather well at his new trade. This was better than the attic. Here he was prepared and had a chance. Time and again, he got his hands on the red curtain, only to be dragged back and subjected to a new attack. The sailor was seeking to knock him out, and though many of his blows went home, that happy result, from the standpoint of the red-haired man, was unaccountably delayed. John Quincy had a similar aim in life. They lunged noisily about the room, while the surprising Orientals in the front of the shop continued their quiet game. John Quincy felt himself growing weary. His breath came painfully. He realized that his adversary had not yet begun to fight. Standing with his back to the table in an idle moment, while the red-haired man made plans for the future, the boy hit on a plan of his own. He overturned the table. The lamp crashed down. Darkness fell over the world, and the final glimmer of light, he saw the big man coming for him, and dropping to his knees he tackled, in the approved manner of Soldiers Field, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Culture prevailed. The sailor went on his head with a resounding thump. John Quincy let go of him and sought the nearest exit. It happened to be the door at the rear, and it was unlocked. He passed hurriedly through a cluttered backyard, and, climbing a fence, found himself in the neighborhood known as the River District. They're in crazy alleys that have no names, no sidewalks, no beginning, and no end. 5 races lived together in the dark. Some houses were above the walk level, some below. All were out of alignment. John Quincy felt he had wandered into a futurist drawing. As he paused, he heard the whine and clatter of Chinese music, the clicking of a typewriter, the rasp of a cheap phonograph playing American jazz, the distant scream of an auto horn, a child wailing Japanese lamentations. Footsteps in the yard beyond the fence roused him, and he fled. He must get out of this mystic maze of mean alleys, and at once. Odd painted faces loomed in the dusk, pasty white faces with just a suggestion of queer costumes. A babel of tongues, queer eyes that glittered once a lean hand on his arm. A group of moon-faced Chinese children under a lamp who scattered at his approach. And when he paused again out of breath, the patter of many feet, bare feet, sandal feet, the clatter of wooden clogs, the squeak of cheap shoes made in his own Massachusetts. Then suddenly, the thump of large feet, such as might belong to a husky sailor. He moved on. Presently, he came into the comparative quiet of River Street and realized that he had traveled in a circle, for there was Liu Yin's shop again. As he hurried on towards King Street, he saw over his shoulder that the red-haired man still followed. A big touring car, with curtains drawn, waited by the curb. John Quincy leaped in beside the driver. "Get out of here. Quick," he panted. The sleepy Japanese face looked at him through the gloom. "Busy now." "I don't care if you are," began John Quincy, and glanced down at one of the man's arms resting on the wheel. His heart stood still. In the dusk, he saw a wristwatch with an illuminated dial, and the numeral 2 was very dim. Even as he looked, strong hands seized him by the collar and dragged him into the dark tunnel. At the same instant, a red-haired man arrived. "Got him, Mike." "Say, that's luck." He leapt into the rear of the car. Quick able work went forward. John Quincy's hands were bound behind his back. A vile-tasting gag was put in his mouth. "Damned if this bird didn't land me one in the eye," said the red-haired man. "I'll pay him for it when we get aboard. Hey, you, Pier 78, show us some speed." The car leaped forward. John Quincy lay on the dusty floor, bound and helpless. To the docks. But he wasn't thinking of that. He was thinking of the watch on the driver's wrist. A brief run, and they halted in the shadow of a pier shed. John Quincy was lifted and propelled none too gently from the car. His cheek was jammed against one of the buttons holding the side curtain, and he had sufficient presence of mind to catch the gag on it and loosen it. As they left the car, he tried to get a glimpse of its license plate, but he was able to ascertain only the first two figures, 33, before it sped away. His two huge chaperones hurried him along the dock. Some distance off, he saw a little group of men, 3 in white uniforms, 1 in a darker garb. The latter was smoking a pipe. John Quincy's heart leaped. He maneuvered the loosened gag with his teeth so that it dropped about his collar. "Goodbye, Pete." He shouted at the top of his lungs and launched at once into a terrific struggle to break away from his startled captors. There was a moment's delay, and then the clatter of feet along the dock. A stocky boy in a white uniform began an enthusiastic debate with Mike, and the other two were prompt to claim the attention of the red-haired man. Pete Mayberry was at John Quincy's back, cutting the rope on his wrists. "Well, I'll be damned, Mr. Winterslip," he cried. "Same here," laughed John Quincy. "Shanghaied in another minute, but for you." He leapt forward to join the battle, but the red-haired man and his friend had already succumbed to youth and superior forces and were in full retreat. John Quincy followed joyously along the dock and planted his fist back with his old adversary's ear. The sailor staggered, but regained his balance and went on. John Quincy returned to his rescuers. "The last blow is the sweetest," he remarked. "I can place those guys," said Mayberry. "They're off that tramp steamer that's been lying out in the harbor the past week. An opium runner, I'll gamble on it. You go to the police station right away." "Yes," said John Quincy. "I must. But I want to thank you, Mr. Mayberry." And he turned to the white uniforms. "You fellows, too." The stocky lad was picking up his cap. "Why, that's all right," he said. "A real pleasure if you ask me. But look here, old-timer," he added, addressing Mayberry. "How about your Honolulu waterfront and its lost romance? You go tell that to the Marines." As John Quincy hurried away, Pete Mayberry was busily explaining that the thing was unheard of. Not in 20 years, maybe more than that. His voice died in the distance. Howell was in his room, and John Quincy detailed his evening's adventure. The captain was incredulous, but when the boy came to the wrist watch on the driver of the car, he sat up and took notice. "Now you're talking," he cried. "I'll start the force after that card tonight. First two figures, 33, you say. I'll send somebody aboard that tramp too. I can't get away with stuff like that around here." "Oh, never mind them," said John Quincy magnanimously. "Concentrate on the watch." Back in the quiet town, he walked with his head up, his heart full of the joy of battle. And while he thought of it, he stepped into the cable office. The message he sent was addressed to Agatha Parker on that Wyoming ranch. San Francisco or nothing. was all it said. As he walked down the deserted street on his way to the corner to wait for his trolley, he heard quick footsteps on his trail again. Who now? He was sore and weary, a bit fed up on fighting for one evening. He quickened his pace. The steps quickened too. He went even faster. So did his pursuer. Oh, well, might as well stop and face him. John Quincy turned. A young man rushed up, a lean young man in a cap. Mr. Winterslip, ain't it? He thrust a dark brown object into John Quincy's hand. Your July Atlantic, sir, came in on the Maui this morning. Oh, said John Quincy limply. Well, I'll take it. My aunt might like to look at it. Keep the change. Thank you, sir, said the newsman, touching his cap. John Quincy rode out to Waikiki on the last seat of the car. His face was swollen and cut. Every muscle ached. Under his arm, clasped tightly, he held the July Atlantic. But he didn't so much as look at the table of contents. We move. We advance. He told himself exultantly, for he had seen the watch with the illuminated dial, the dial on which the numeral 2 was very dim. Chapter 20. The Story of Lao Ho. Early Sunday morning, John Quincy was awakened by a sharp knock on his door. Rising sleepily and donning dressing gown and slippers, he opened it to admit his Aunt Minerva. She had a worried air. Are you all right, John Quincy? She inquired. Surely. That is, I would be, if I hadn't been dragged out of bed a full hour before I intended to get up. I'm sorry, but I had to have a look at you. She took a newspaper from under her arm and handed it to him. What's all this? An 8-column head on the first page caught even John Quincy's sleepy eye. Bostonian has strange adventure on waterfront. Smaller heads announced that Mr. John Quincy Winterslip had been rescued from an unwelcome trip to China in the nick of time by 3 midshipmen from the Oregon. Poor Pete Maybury. He had been the real hero of the affair, but his own paper would not come out again until Monday evening, and rivals had beaten him to the story. John Quincy yawned. All true, my dear, he said. I was on the verge of leaving you when the Navy saved me. Life, you perceive, has become a musical comedy. But why should anyone want to Shanghai you? Cried Miss Minerva. I hoped you'd ask me that. It happens that your nephew has a brain. His keen analytical work as a detective is getting someone's goat. He admitted as much in a letter he sent me tonight. He took a few shots at my head. Someone shot at you. Gasped Miss Minerva. I'll say so. You rather fancy yourself as a sleuth, but is anybody taking aim at you from behind bushes? Answer me that. Miss Minerva sat down weakly on the chair. You're going home on the next boat, she announced. He laughed. About 2 weeks ago, I made that suggestion to you. And what was your reply? Ah, my dear, the tables are turned. I'm not going home on the next boat. I need never go home. This gay, carefree, sudden country begins to appeal to me. Let me read about myself. He returned to the paper. The clock was turned back 30 years on the Honolulu waterfront last night, began the somewhat imaginative account. It closed with the news that the trans steamer Mary S. Allison had left port before the police could board her. Evidently, she'd had steam up and papers ready and was only awaiting the return of the red-haired man and his victim. John Quincy handed the newspaper back to his aunt. Too bad, he remarked. They slipped through Howard's fingers. Of course they did, she snapped. Everybody does. I'd like a talk with Captain Hallett. If I could only tell him when I think of him, I feel better. Save that paper, John Quincy said. I want to send it to Mother. She stared at him. Are you mad? Poor Grace. She'd have a nervous breakdown. I only hope she doesn't hear of this until you're back in Boston, safe and sound. Oh, yes, Boston, laughed John Quincy. Quaint old town, they tell me. I must visit there someday. Now, if you'll leave me a minute, I'll prepare to join you at breakfast and relate the story of my adventurous life. Very well, agreed Miss Minerva. Rising up, she paused at the door. A little witch hazel might help your face. The scars of honorable battle, said her nephew. Why remove them? Honorable fiddlesticks, Miss Minerva answered. After all, the Back Bay has its good points. But in the hall outside, she smiled a delighted little smile. When John Quincy and his aunt were leaving the dining room after breakfast, Kamaikui, stiff and dignified in a freshly laundered holoku, approached the boy. So very happy to see you safe this morning, she announced. Why, thank you, Kamaikui, he answered. He wondered, was Kala responsible for his troubles? And if so, did this huge silent woman know of her grandson's activities? Poor thing, Miss Minerva said as they entered the living room. She's been quite downcast since Dan went. I'm sorry for her. I've always liked her. Naturally, smiled John Quincy. There's a bond between you. What's that? Two vanishing races, yours and hers, the Boston Brahmin and the pure Hawaiian. Later in the morning, Carlotta Egan telephoned him, greatly excited. She had just seen the Sunday paper. All true, he admitted. All while you were dancing your heart out, I was struggling to sidestep a cook's tour of the Orient. I shouldn't have had a happy moment if I'd known. Then? I'm glad you didn't. Big party, I suppose? Yes. You know, I've been terribly worried about you ever since that night on the avenue. I want to talk with you. Will you come to see me? Will I? I'm on my way already. He hung up the receiver and hastened down the beach. Carlotta was sitting on the white sand not far from the reef and palm, all in white herself. A serious, wide-eyed Carlotta, quite different from the gay girl who had been hurrying to a party the night before. John Quincy dropped down beside her, and for a time they talked of the dance and of his adventure. Suddenly, she turned to him. I have no right to ask it, I know, but I want you to do something for me. It will make me very happy. Anything you ask. Go back to Boston. What? Not that. I was wrong. That wouldn't make me happy. Yes, it would. You don't think so now. Perhaps. You're dazzled by the sun out here. But this isn't your kind of place. We're not your kind of people. You think you like us, but you'd soon forget. Back among your own sort. The sort who are interested in the things that interest you. Private. Please, go. It would be retreating under fire, he objected. But you proved your courage last night. I'm afraid for you. Someone out here has a terrible grudge against you. I'd never forgive Hawaii if anything happened to you. That's sweet of you. He moved closer, but, confound it, there was Agatha. Down to Agatha, by all the ties of honor. He edged away again. I'll think about it. He agreed. I'm leaving Honolulu too, you know. She reminded him. I know. You'll have a wonderful time in England. She shook her head. Oh, I dread the whole idea. Dad's heart is set on it, and I shall go to please him. but I shan't enjoy it. I'm not up to England. Nonsense. No, I'm not. I'm unsophisticated, crude, really, just a girl of the islands. But you wouldn't care to stay here all your life. No, indeed. It's a beautiful spot to loll about in, but I've too much northern blood to be satisfied with that. One of these days, I want Dad to sell, and we'll go to the mainland. I could get some sort of work, pull, 10-year, end quote. Any particular place on the mainland? Well, I haven't been about much, of course. But all the time I was at school, I kept thinking I'd rather live in San Francisco than anywhere else in the world. Good, John Quincy cried. That's my choice, too. You remember that morning on the ferry, how you held out your hand to me and said, "Welcome to your city," but you corrected me at once. You said you belonged in Boston. I see my error now. She shook her head, a moment's madness. But you'll recover. You're an Easterner, and you could never be happy anywhere else. Oh yes, I could, he assured her. I'm a Winterslip, a wandering Winterslip. Any old place we hang our hats. This time, he did lean rather close. I could be happy anywhere, he began. He wanted to add with you, but Agatha's slim patrician hand was on his shoulder. Anywhere, he repeated, with a different inflection. A gong sounded from the reef and palm. Carlotta, Rose, that's lunch. John Quincy stood too. It's beside the point. Where you go, she went on. I asked you to do something for me. I know if you'd asked anything else in the world, I'd be up to my neck in it now. But what you suggest would take a bit of doing. To leave Hawaii and say goodbye to you. I meant to be very firm about it, she broke in. But I must have a little time to consider. Will you wait? She smiled up at him. You're so much wiser than I am, she said. Yes, I'll wait. He went slowly along the beach. Unsophisticated, yes, and charming. You're so much wiser than I am. Where on the mainland could one encounter a girl nowadays? He'd say that. He had quite forgotten, but she smiled when she said it. In the afternoon, John Quincy visited the police station. Hallett was in his room in rather a grouchy mood. Jan was out somewhere, hunting the watch. No, they hadn't found it yet. John Quincy was mildly reproving. Well, you saw it, didn't you? Growled Howard. Why in Sam Hill didn't you grab it? Because they tied my hands, John Quincy reminded him. I've narrowed the search down for you to the taxi drivers of Honolulu. Hundreds of them, my boy. More than that, I've given you the first two numbers on the license plate of the car. If you're any good at all, you ought to be able to land that watch now. Oh, we'll land it, Hallett said. Give us time. Time was just what John Quincy had to give them. Monday came and went. Miss Minerva was bitterly sarcastic. Patience are a very lovely virtue, John Quincy told her. I got that from Charlie. At any rate, she snapped, it are a virtue very much needed with Captain Hallett in charge. In another direction, too, John Quincy was called upon to exercise patience. Agatha Parker was unaccountably silent regarding that short peremptory cable he had sent on his big night in town. Was she offended? The Parkers are notoriously not a family who accepted dictation. But in such a vital matter as this, a girl should be willing to listen to reason. Late Tuesday afternoon, Chan telephoned from the station house, unquestionably Chan this time. Would John Quincy do him the great honor to join him for an early dinner at the Alexander Young Cafe? Something doing, Charlie? Cried the boy eagerly. Maybe it might be, answered Chan. And maybe also not. At 6 o'clock, in hotel lobby, if you roll so far, condescend. I'll be there, John Quincy promised. And he was. He greeted Chan with anxious, inquiring eyes, but the Chinaman was suave and entirely non-committal. He led John Quincy to the dining room and carefully selected a table by a front window. Do me the great favor to recline, he suggested. John Quincy reclined. Charlie, don't keep me in suspense, he pleaded. Chan smiled. Let us not shade the feast with gloomy murder talk, he replied. This our social meeting. Is it that you are in the mood to dry up plate of soup? Why, yes. Of course, John Quincy answered. Politeness, he saw, dictated that he hide his curiosity. 2 of the soup, ordered Chan of a white-jacketed waiter. A car drew up to the door of the Alexander Young. Chan half rose, staring at it keenly. He dropped back to his seat. It is my high delight to entertain you thus humbly before you are restored to Boston. Converse at some length of Boston. I feel interested. Really, smiled the boy. Indubitably. Gentlemen I meet once say, Boston are like China. The future of both, he say, lies in graveyards, where repose useless bodies of honored guests on high. I am fog as to meaning. He meant both places live in the past, John Quincy explained. He was right, in a way. Boston, like China, boasts a glorious history. But that's not saying the Boston of today isn't progressing. Why? Do you know? He talked eloquently of his native city. Chan listened rapt. Always, he sighed, when John Quincy finished. I have unlimited yearning for travel. He paused to watch another car draw up before the hotel, but it are unavailable. I am policeman, on small remuneration. In my youth, rambling on evening, living hillside, or by moonlit ocean, I dream of more lofty position. Not so now, but that other American citizen, my eldest son, he are dreaming too. Maybe for him dreams eventuate. Perhaps he become second Baby Ruth, homeroom emperor, applause of thousands, making him deaf. Who knows it? The dinner passed, unshaded by gloomy talk, and they went outside. Chan proffered a cigar of which he spoke in the most belittling fashion. He suggested that they stand for a time before the hotel door. Waiting for somebody? Inquired John Quincy, unable longer to dissemble. Precisely the fact. Barely dare to mention it, however. Great disappointment. May drive up here. Any minute now. An open car stopped before the hotel entrance. John Quincy's eyes sought the license plate, and he got an immediate thrill. The first 2 figures were 33. A party of tourists, a man and 2 women, alighted. The doorman ran forward and busied himself with luggage. Chan casually strolled across the walk, and as the Japanese driver shifted his gears preparatory to driving away, put a restraining hand on the car door. One moment, please. The Jap turned, fright in his eyes. You are Okuda, from auto stand across way. Yes, hissed the driver. You are now returned from exploring island with party of tourists? You leave this spot early Sunday morning. Yes, Is it possible that you wear wristwatch, please? Yeses, dying to reveal face of same. The Jap hesitated. Chan leaned far over into the car and thrust aside the man's coat sleeve. He came back, a pleased light in his eyes, and held open the rear door. Kindly embark into tonneau, Mr. Winterslip. Obediently, John Quincy got in. Chan took his place by the driver's side. The police station, if you will be so kind. The car leaped forward. The essential clue. They had it at last. John Quincy's heart beat fast there in the rear of the car, where only a few nights before he had been bound and gagged. Captain Hallett's grim face relaxed into happy lines when he met them at the door of his room. You got him, eh? Good work. He glanced at the prisoner's wrist. Rip that watch off him, Charlie. Charlie obeyed. He examined the watch for a moment and handed it to his chief. An expensive timepiece of noted brand, he announced. Numeral 2, faint and far away. One other fact emerged into light. This Jap here have small wrist, yet worn place on strap, convey impression of being worn by man, with wrist of vastly larger circumference. Hallett nodded. Yes, that's right. Some other man is onto this watch. He had a big wrist, but most men in Honolulu have, you know? Sit down, Okuda. I want to hear from you. You understand what it means to lie to me. I do not lie, sir. No, you bet your sweet life you don't. First, tell me who engaged your car last Saturday night. Saturday night. That's what I said. Ah, yes. 2 sailors from ship. Engaged for evening, paying large cash at once. Our drive to shop on River Street. Wait long time. Then off we go to dock, with extra passenger in back. Know the names of those sailors? Could not say. What ship were they from? How can I know? Not told. All right, I'm coming to the important thing. Understand? The truth, that's what I want. Where did you get this watch? Chan and John Quincy leaned forward eagerly. I buy him, said the Jap. You bought him? Where? At jewel store, or Chinese Lao Ho, on Mauna Kea Street. Howlett turned to Chan. Know the place, Charlie. Chan nodded. Yes, indeed. Open? Now? Open until hour of 10, maybe more. Good, said Howlett. Come along, Okuda. You can drive us there. Lao Ho, a little wizened Chinaman, sat back at his workbench with a microscope screwed into one dim old eye. The 4 men who entered his tiny store filled it to overflowing, but he gave them barely a glance. Come on, Ho, wake up, Hallett cried. I want to talk to you. With the utmost deliberation, the Chinaman descended from his stool and approached the counter. He regarded Hallett with a hostile eye. The captain laid the wristwatch on top of a showcase, in which reposed many trays of jade. Ever see that before? As the sister is still Lao Ho regarded it casually. Slowly, he raised his eyes. Maybe so. Cannot say, he replied, in a high, squeaky voice. Hallett reddened. Nonsense. You had it here, in the store, and you sold it to this Jap. Now didn't you? Rahul dreamily regarded the taxi driver. Maybe so. Cannot say. Damn it, cried Hallett. You know who I am? Policeman. Maybe. Policeman. Maybe yes. And I want you to tell me about this watch. Now, wake up and come across, or by the Lord, Harry.
Chan laid a deferential hand on his chief's arm.
Humbly suggest I attempt this, he said. Hallett nodded. All right, here's your meet He drew back. Chan bowed with a great show of politeness. He launched into a long story in Chinese. Lao Ho looked at him with slight interest. Presently, he squeaked a brief reply. Chan resumed his flow of talk. Occasionally he paused, and Lao Ho spoke. In a few moments, Chan turned beaming. Story are now completely extracted like aching tooth, he said. Wristwatch was brought to Lao Ho on Thursday, same week as murder. Offered him on sale by young man darkly colored with small knife scar marring cheek. Lao Ho, buy and repair watch interior works, being in injured state. Saturday morning, he sell at seemly profit to Japanese. Presumably this Okuda here, but Lao Ho will not swear. Saturday night, dark young man appear, much overwhelmed with excitement and demand watch. Again, please. Lao Ho say, it is sold to Japanese. Which Japanese? Lao Ho is not aware of name, and it can't describe all Japanese faces, being uninteresting outlook for him. Dark young man, person fly. Appear frequently demanding any news, but Lao Ho is unable to oblige. Such are the story of this jewel merchant here. They went out on the street. Howlett scowled at the Jap. Right, ran along. I'll keep the watch. Very thankful, said the taxi driver, and leaped into his car. Howlett turned to Chan, a dark young man with a scar. He queried. Clear enough to me, Chan answered. Same are the Spaniard Jose Cabrera, careless man about town with reputation not so savory. Mr. Winterslip, is it that you have forgotten him? John Quincy started. Me? Did I ever see him? Recall, said Chan. It are the night following murder. You and I linger in all-American restaurant, engaged in debate regarding hygiene of par. Door open, admitting Bowker, steward on underscore president. Tyler underscore joyously, full of Okolhow. With him are dark young man, this Jose Cabrera himself. Oh, I remember now, John Quincy answered. Well, the Spaniard's easy to pick up, said Howard. I'll have him inside an hour. One moment, please, interposed Chan. Tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, the President Tyler returned from Orient. You'll gamble myself, but we'll wager incredible sum. Spaniard waits on dock for Mr. Bowker. If you present no fierce objection, I have a yearning to arrest him at that very moment. Why, of course, agreed Howlett. He looked keenly at Charlie Chan. Charlie, you old rascal, you got the scent at last. Who? Me? Grinned Chan. With your gracious permission, I would alter the picture. Stone walls are crumbling, now like dust. Through many loopholes, light stream in, like rosy streaks of dawn.